Imagine driving down a dark, heavily forested highway on a cold winter night, surrounded by nothing but towering trees and the faint glow of your own headlights. That was the reality for dozens of commuters traveling on the A3 highway in Surrey, England, on the evening of December 11th, 2002. Surrey is known for being one of the most heavily wooded counties in all of Great Britain, and at night, the thick forests on either side of the asphalt can feel incredibly claustrophobic. Around 7:20 p.m. on this particular night, the peace of that drive was completely shattered. The local police department began receiving a flood of frantic emergency calls from drivers on the highway. The callers were all describing the exact same terrifying scene. They said there was a motorist driving with absolute madness on the road. This driver had their high beams on, completely blinding anyone in front of them, and they were weaving wildly in and out of the heavy traffic. The car was traveling at an incredibly high speed, tailgating people and nearly causing multiple pileups. And then, just a few minutes later, several of the callers reported something even more horrifying. They had actually watched this reckless car veer completely off the asphalt, hurtle down the steep, grassy embankment on the side of the highway, and plunge directly into the thick, dark tree line. To the callers, it looked like a catastrophic high-speed crash, and they were certain that whoever was inside that vehicle was either severely injured or dead. And so, the police department immediately dispatched a couple of officers to the scene to investigate. When the two officers arrived at the stretch of the A3 where the callers had reported the crash, they turned on their spotlight and began driving slowly along the shoulder. But the problem was, they couldn't see anything. There were no tire tracks in the grass, no broken branches on the trees, no debris on the ground, and no smoke rising from the forest. It was just a quiet, dark stretch of highway with normal traffic passing by. They drove up and down the road several times, shining their lights into the darkness, but there was absolutely no sign of an accident. At this point, if only one person had called, the officers would have assumed it was a mistake or a prank. But because so many different drivers had called in to report the exact same thing at the exact same time, the officers knew they couldn't just give up and go back to the station. They decided to park their patrol car on the shoulder, get out, and continue their search on foot. They turned on their high-powered flashlights and began walking along the edge of the dense forest, shining their lights directly into the thick brush. The woods were incredibly dense, and the winter darkness seemed to swallow the light from their torches. They walked for quite a while, their boots crunching on the frozen grass, searching for any indication that a vehicle had crashed into the trees. And then, after walking a significant distance, one of the officers stopped. His flashlight had caught a tiny glint of something reflective deep in the woods. It looked like a piece of plastic or metal, which was completely out of place among the dirt and tree trunks. The two officers stepped off the shoulder, slid down the steep embankment, and pushed their way into the thick, overgrown tree line. As they got closer, they realized they had indeed found a car. It was a heavily damaged hatchback, completely wedged between two large oak trees and covered in dirt, dead leaves, and branches. It was totally invisible from the road. The officers immediately called for backup and ran toward the vehicle, preparing themselves to find a badly injured driver. They looked through the shattered glass of the driver's side window, but to their surprise, the driver's seat was completely empty. They walked around to the other side of the vehicle and saw that the front passenger door was swung wide open. And there, lying on the ground just outside the open door, was a body. But when the officers shone their flashlights onto the body, they froze in complete disbelief. What they were looking at made absolutely no sense at all. To understand why these officers were so completely caught off guard, we have to go back 5 months in time to the night of July 16th, 2002. On that warm summer night, a 21-year-old man named Christopher Brian Chandler was sitting in a pub in West London, finishing up a beer. This pub was located about an hour north of that stretch of the A3 highway in Surrey where the crashed car had just been found. Christopher was at the pub with a close friend, and it was supposed to be a fun night out. But as the hours passed, Christopher began to feel incredibly anxious. He couldn't sit still, and he kept staring nervously at the door. It turns out Christopher was actually a wanted man. The police in London were actively searching for him in connection with a robbery, and because of this, Christopher hated staying in one place for too long. He was terrified that the authorities would walk through the door at any second. He was being so secretive that the only people who even knew his whereabouts that night were the friend sitting across from him and his brother, whom Christopher had called earlier in the evening. Eventually, the paranoia became too much for Christopher to handle. He told his friend that he had to leave immediately. He said goodbye, walked out of the pub, got into his car, and began driving south. But Christopher never arrived at his destination. He simply disappeared, and nobody heard from him again. Christopher's brother eventually went to the police and reported him missing. But the problem was, the brother knew Christopher was wanted for robbery, so he assumed Christopher had just gone on the run to escape the law. The police felt the exact same way. They figured Christopher was actively trying to elude them, so they didn't put much effort into searching for him. The missing person report was filed away, and everybody just moved on. Fast forward to 5 months later, on December 11th, when those frantic drivers called the police about the reckless car crashing into the woods. When the two officers stood over the body they had found in the forest, they realized they were looking at Christopher's car. But when they looked down at the body lying next to the open passenger door, they saw that it was not a fresh casualty of a recent crash. It was almost entirely a skeleton. The flesh had completely decayed, the clothes were weathered, and it was obvious that this person had been dead for months. The forensic investigators who arrived at the scene would later confirm that the skeletal remains did indeed belong to Christopher Brian Chandler. They estimated that he had died on the very night he disappeared 5 months earlier on July 16th. This meant that Christopher had crashed his car and died in those woods in the middle of summer. But this realization created a mind-bending paradox. If Christopher had been dead in those woods for 5 months, who was driving the car that dozens of motorists saw tearing down the A3 that very night? Who was the reckless driver who veered off the road and crashed into the embankment at 7:20 p.m. on December 11th? The Surrey police tried to explain this by saying it was all just one massive, unbelievable coincidence. Their official theory was that there actually was a reckless driver on the highway that night, but that driver had somehow managed to recover from their near crash, pull back onto the road, and drive away undetected. And then, by sheer luck, when the police went searching that specific area of the woods, they just happened to stumble upon Christopher's 5-month-old crash site. But the problem was, several of the callers had been very specific. They didn't just see a car drive erratically, they watched it go over the embankment and crash into the trees in real time. And when the police searched that exact spot, they found Christopher's car, which had all the hallmarks of a fresh, violent impact, yet the driver had been dead for half a year. To this day, there is no logical explanation for how those drivers witnessed a crash happening in real time that had actually occurred 5 months in the past. It remains one of England's most famous and haunting mysteries, known to the public as the A3 ghost crash. Now, our next story takes us to northern France, to a quiet, picturesque little village where life moved at a very slow and peaceful pace. On the morning of August 2nd, 2017, 2 men were sitting together inside a local bar, laughing, drinking, and talking. These 2 men were Lucien Perrault and Olivier Boudin. Even though there was a massive age difference between them, with Lucien being 69 years old and Olivier being 38, the 2 were absolutely inseparable. The locals in the village actually referred to them as father and son because they were always together, looking out for one another. Lucien had spent his entire life working hard in a manufacturing plant in a nearby city, but just 4 years earlier, he had finally retired and moved into a small house in this quiet village. But when he first moved in, he was incredibly lonely and depressed. Lucien was divorced, he struggled heavily with alcohol, and he felt like he had nothing left to look forward to in life. But then he met Olivier, and everything changed. When they first met, Olivier was also going through a very difficult time. He was dealing with some chronic health issues that made it hard for him to maintain steady work, and he was constantly bouncing between the nearby city and the village, trying to find his footing. When these two men connected, they instantly bonded over their shared struggles. For Lucien, what really mattered was that Olivier, despite being so much younger, never treated him like a useless old man. He treated Lucien like a true peer and a best friend. Before long, their lives became completely intertwined. They created a daily routine of meeting up, walking through the village, and helping each other out, which gave both of them a brand new sense of purpose and joy. On this particular morning, as they sat in the local bar, they began talking about what they wanted to do that night. They decided they would have a nice summer barbecue at Lucien's house. Lucien would grill up some beautiful beef ribs, and they would sit out on his back garden patio, drink some wine, and spend the evening enjoying the warm summer air. It sounded like a wonderful, simple plan. In fact, the bartender would later recall overhearing their conversation and remembering just how incredibly excited both men seemed about their upcoming cookout. And so, that evening, Olivier and Lucien arrived at Lucien's house and headed out to the backyard patio. Lucien had gone to the trouble of setting up a lovely scene. He had placed a small round table on the patio and covered it with a classic red and white checkered tablecloth. On the table, he set out an open bottle of wine, some fresh cheese, and a baguette. Olivier sat down at the table, pouring them some wine and enjoying the food, while Lucien walked over to the grill to start cooking up the beef ribs. Now, Lucien had a neighbor who lived very close by, whom we will call Marie. Marie's second-floor bedroom window directly overlooked Lucien's backyard patio. That night, as the sun began to set, Marie happened to glance out her window and saw the two men. They were playing music, laughing, and goofing around, having a great time. Marie was very used to seeing them spend time together, and she knew they often stayed up late, drinking and talking. She didn't want to be a nosy neighbor, so she simply closed her window to block out the noise, went to bed, and fell asleep to the distant sound of their music and laughter. The next morning, around 6 a.m., Marie woke up and looked out her window once again. She glanced down into Lucien's yard, and what she saw didn't surprise her at all. Lucien was still sitting perfectly upright at the round table, looking as though he might be eating or drinking. Olivier, however, was lying flat on his back on the ground next to the table, completely passed out. Marie chuckled to herself, thinking that the two men had clearly stayed up all night drinking, and Olivier had simply fallen asleep on the grass. She didn't want to judge them, so she decided to mind her own business and went about her morning. A few hours later, around 9 a.m., Marie left her house to go to another neighbor's property to feed their chickens while they were away for the day. As she walked past Lucien's yard, she glanced through the fence and saw that the scene had not changed at all. Lucien was still sitting at the table in the exact same position, and Olivier was still lying motionless on the grass. Marie started to feel a small twinge of concern, but she figured they were just sleeping off an incredibly heavy hangover, so she kept going, fed the chickens, and spent the morning doing her chores. But when Marie returned to her house around noon, she looked into the yard again, and this time she was genuinely alarmed. The sun was now high in the sky, and the summer heat was becoming intense. Yet, Lucien and Olivier had still not moved a single fraction of an inch. Lucien was still slumped at the table, and Olivier was still spread out on the grass. Marie realized that even if they were severely intoxicated, the blistering heat of the midday sun would have forced them to wake up by now. They were going to get severe heat stroke if they stayed out there any longer. And then Marie walked up to the edge of the yard and began shouting their names, trying to get them to wake up. But she got absolutely no response. Realizing that something was terribly wrong, Marie panicked. She ran to a nearby neighbor's house, told them what was happening, and together they grabbed several large pots of cold water. They ran back into Lucian's yard and threw the water over both men, hoping the sudden shock would wake them up from their drunken stupor. But when the cold water hit them, neither man flinched. They didn't move at all. Marie reached out and touched Lucian's arm, and she immediately realized they were cold. They were both dead. The next day, the local prosecutor made a public announcement stating that they were launching a full criminal investigation into the two men's deaths, which were being treated as highly suspicious. The prosecutor explained that it appeared Lucian and Olivier had died at the exact same time, leading investigators to believe this was either a double homicide or a tragic murder-suicide. The primary theory was that someone had put a deadly poison in their food or wine. The police began searching the patio for evidence. They found a can of beans that the men had been eating, along with the remains of the beef, the bread, and the wine. They immediately shipped the canned beans to a highly specialized medical institute in Paris to test for botulism, which is a rare and extremely lethal toxin that can grow inside improperly sealed canned goods. But a few days later, the results came back completely negative. There was no botulism. The police then sent the rest of the food and the wine to several other forensic laboratories to be tested for a wide range of chemical poisons, heavy metals, and toxic substances. But once again, every single test came back completely clear. There was absolutely nothing toxic in anything they had consumed. The investigators were completely baffled. There were no signs of a struggle, no physical injuries on either body, and no trace of poison. How could two best friends suddenly drop dead at the exact same moment in the middle of a peaceful backyard barbecue? But then the official autopsies were completed, and the forensic pathologists discovered a series of events so incredibly tragic and bizarre that no one could have ever predicted them. It turned out that Lucian and Olivier were not murdered, nor was it a suicide. They had died due to an almost impossible combination of minor, non-fatal medical issues that collided in the worst possible way at the exact same moment. The autopsies revealed that Lucian had very poor dental health and was missing a large number of his teeth. Olivier, on the other hand, suffered from a condition called cardiomegaly, which meant his heart was slightly enlarged and fragile. While this condition was being monitored by doctors and was fully under control, it made his heart highly sensitive to sudden, extreme stress. On the night of August 2nd, these minor medical issues became a recipe for disaster. Lucian had grilled up a plate of tough beef ribs. Because he was missing so many teeth, he had a very hard time chewing the meat, but he was enjoying the food and the company so much that he was wolfing it down very quickly. At some point during the meal, Lucian swallowed a massive, unchewed chunk of the tough beef rib. The meat got securely lodged in his throat, completely blocking his airway. Lucian began to desperately choke, turning blue and gasping for air. Sitting right across from him, Olivier watched his best friend and father figure suddenly start dying in front of him. Olivier was immediately seized with an overwhelming wave of panic and terror. He jumped up from his chair, his adrenaline spiking as he prepared to run to his friend's aid. But the sheer shock, terror, and physical exertion of that sudden, high-stress moment was too much for Olivier's fragile, enlarged heart. The intense stress caused his heart to instantly seize up. He suffered a massive fatal heart attack and collapsed dead onto the grass. Meanwhile, Lucian was still choking. With Olivier now lying dead on the ground, Lucian had absolutely no one left to perform the Heimlich maneuver or help him clear his airway. He remained slumped over the table, desperately struggling to breathe, until he finally suffocated and died right there in his chair. The next morning, when Marie looked out her window, she wasn't looking at two hungover friends sleeping off a wild night of drinking. She was looking at the silent, tragic scene of an unbelievable double tragedy. The two inseparable friends who had brought so much joy and meaning back into each other's lives had been taken away in a matter of minutes by a cruel freak sequence of events. Our third story takes us to the vast, beautiful, and incredibly treacherous waters off the northeastern coast of Australia. It was a little after 7 a.m. on the morning of April 15th, 2007, when three close friends launched a beautiful 35-foot white catamaran called the Kaz 2 from a local marina. They were setting off on what they all believed would be the ultimate adventure of their lives. The captain of the Kaz 2 was 56-year-old Des Batten. Des was a highly experienced, deeply responsible sailor who had spent months meticulously planning every single aspect of this journey. The two friends he was bringing along with him were Jim Tunstead, who was 63 years old, and Jim's older brother, Peter Tunstead, who was 69. These three men were not reckless risk-takers. They were stable, devoted family men who had all been happily married to their wives for over 30 years. Des had 2 children, Jim had 4, and Peter had 5. They were all either fully retired or right on the verge of retirement, and this voyage was meant to be a grand celebration of their hard work and the beginning of a peaceful new chapter in their lives. Their planned route was incredibly ambitious. They were going to sail the Kaz 2 from the northeastern side of Australia, travel all the way up and around the northern coast of the continent, and then head down the western coast to their final destination of Perth, where they all lived. The entire trip was scheduled to take about 8 weeks. The men were absolutely giddy with excitement at the prospect of spending 2 full months out on the open water, fishing, drinking cold beers, and enjoying each other's company. They had spent a lot of time and money preparing the boat to ensure it was completely safe and seaworthy. Shortly after they launched the boat on April 15th, Peter's wife called his cell phone to see how the departure had gone. When Peter answered, she could immediately hear the immense joy in his voice. In the background, she could hear Des and Jim laughing and joking around, clearly having the time of their lives. Peter told his wife that the weather was absolutely gorgeous, the water was as calm as glass, and they were about to set up their fishing rods and crack open some beers. It sounded like the absolute perfect start to their dream trip. Peter told his wife that he loved her, promised to keep her updated, and then they hung up the phone. Now, because Des was a highly experienced sailor and a member of a volunteer marine rescue group, he was absolutely obsessed with safety. He knew how quickly the ocean could turn deadly. Before they even set foot on the boat for the trip, Des made Jim and Peter go through multiple rigorous man-overboard drills on the Kaz 2. He wanted to make absolutely certain that if anyone fell into the water, the remaining crew members would know exactly how to operate the life-saving equipment and pull them back on board safely. They practiced these drills until they were completely second nature. Furthermore, when they charted their course, Des established a very strict rule. They would always sail close to the shoreline. They would never venture out into the deep, unpredictable open ocean because staying close to the coast meant they would always be within reach of help if an emergency arose. To document their journey, Jim had brought along a video camera, and around 10 a.m. on that first morning, he turned it on and began filming. In the video, which would later be recovered, the men look completely happy and relaxed. Des is at the helm, smiling warmly, while Peter sits nearby. In the background of the video, the Australian coastline is clearly visible, proving that they were strictly adhering to Des's safety rule of staying close to the shore. But just a few hours after Jim stopped recording that video, things began to take an incredibly strange turn. A woman named Isabel Wheeler, who did not know the three men and had never seen the Kaz 2 before, was fishing from the shore in an area called Champagne Bay. As she looked out over the water, she spotted a beautiful white 35-foot catamaran sailing from east to west along the horizon. She watched it for a little while, but then she saw the boat make a sudden, sharp 90-degree turn. Instead of continuing along the safe, planned route near the coast, the catamaran began sailing directly out towards the deep, open ocean, away from the safety of the land. Isabel didn't think much of it at the time, as she had no idea about the men's strict safety rules, so she just went back to fishing. But the problem was, the very next day, April 16th, two other independent witnesses, who also didn't know the crew, were looking out over the water near Champagne Bay. Quite incredibly, they both spotted the Kaz-2 sailing from east to west in the exact same spot where Isabel had seen it the day before. Now, this made absolutely no sense. The Kaz-2 was on a strict point-to-point journey to Perth. There was absolutely no reason for them to double back and spend 24 hours sailing in circles in the exact same bay. But the witnesses were certain of what they saw. And then, on the following day, April 17th, a group of local fishermen were working in the waters farther north of Champagne Bay. They saw the Kaz-2 navigating its way incredibly close to the shore, but the fishermen were deeply concerned because the area the catamaran was sailing through was a notorious, highly dangerous coral reef system. One wrong move could easily rip the bottom of the boat open. Furthermore, the fishermen noticed that the boat's massive sails were completely torn to shreds, flapping wildly in the wind. However, as they watched the boat, they saw a Mei standing at the helm, calmly steering the vessel through the dangerous reefs. The pilot looked so completely in control of the boat that the fishermen assumed he knew exactly what he was doing, so they decided not to intervene or report it. Then came April 18th. A Coast Watch surveillance helicopter was flying its routine patrol over the Great Barrier Reef when the crew looked down and spotted the Kaz-2. The helicopter crew immediately noticed that the catamaran's sails were badly damaged and the boat was navigating through some very treacherous, shallow waters. The helicopter crew tried to contact the Kaz-2 over the marine radio, calling them multiple times to ask if they needed assistance. But there was only silence on the radio. No one answered. The helicopter crew watched the boat through binoculars. They could see a figure at the helm, steering the boat expertly between the coral reefs. Because the pilot seemed to have the situation under control, and because they didn't see any obvious signs of distress, the helicopter crew decided not to initiate a full-scale rescue. However, they did feel that the situation was strange enough to warrant a check, so they contacted the marine police and gave them the boat's coordinates, suggesting they send a patrol boat out to make contact. But when the marine police finally reached the designated area, the Kaz-2 was gone. The police immediately began looking into the boat's registration and contacted the families of Des, Jim, and Peter. The families were frantic. They told the police that except for the brief phone call Peter had made to his wife on the morning of April 15th, not a single one of them had heard from the men. They had gone completely silent. They hadn't answered any phone calls, and they hadn't checked in as planned. At this point, the authorities realized they were dealing with a major emergency. A massive air and sea search was launched, utilizing multiple planes, helicopters, and boats to scan the vast ocean. 2 days later, on April 20th, a search helicopter spotted the Kaz-2 floating about 80 miles off the northeastern coast of Australia. The boat's tattered sails were flapping in the wind, and it was drifting listlessly, spinning slowly in circles. From the air, the rescue crew could see that the deck of the catamaran was completely empty. The searchers had no idea what they were dealing with. It was entirely possible that the boat had been boarded by pirates or smugglers, and that Des, Jim, and Peter were being held hostage down below. Or perhaps the men had been killed, and the perpetrators were still hiding inside the cabin, waiting to ambush anyone who approached. Despite the immense danger, a brave rescue officer named Corey Benson volunteered to board the vessel. Corey was lowered from the helicopter into the ocean. He swam through the choppy water, reached the side of the drifting catamaran, and climbed up the ladder onto the deck. The moment his boots hit the wood, he was struck by how eerily quiet it was. There was no sound except for the wind and the tattered sails flapping. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, and no damage to the boat's hull. Corey began to slowly search the deck. As he walked, he started finding clues that indicated the crew had been active just minutes before. He found a fishing rod cast out into the water, securely locked into its holder on the side of the boat, as if someone had been waiting for a bite. On a small outdoor table, there was a blue mug filled with coffee, sitting there undisturbed. On a deck chair, a t-shirt was neatly folded with a pair of reading glasses resting on top of it. Everything looked completely normal, as if the men had just stepped away for a brief moment. Corey walked to the helm and found that the boat's GPS was fully functional and the engine was actually still running, idling quietly. Corey reached over and turned the key, shutting the engine down. Now Corey had to face the most terrifying part of his mission, searching the cabin below. He knew that if there were hostile hijackers on board, they would be waiting for him down there. He drew a deep breath, walked down the short flight of stairs, and opened the door to the cabin. He stepped into a small, neat, common area that served as a kitchen and living space. On the table, he saw a newspaper dated April 15th, the day the men had set sail. On the wall, a calendar had days crossed off up until April 14th, but April 15th was untouched. On another table, a laptop computer was open, plugged in, and fully powered on, showing a screen that looked like someone had just been using it. Nearby, there were plates of food set out, looking relatively fresh, as if a meal had just been prepared and was about to be eaten. Corey looked into the sleeping quarters and saw that the beds had been slept in, and the men's personal belongings, including their wallets, cash, identification, and life jackets, were all sitting exactly where they should be. But Des, Jim, and Peter were nowhere to be found. They had completely vanished from the face of the earth, leaving behind a perfectly functional boat with a running engine, food on the table, and all of their safety gear untouched. A massive investigation was launched to try and piece together what had happened on the Kaz-2. But the deeper the investigators dug, the more confusing the mystery became. Why had the boat been seen turning out toward the open ocean, directly violating the captain's strict safety rules? Why had it been seen doubling back and sailing in circles in Champagne Bay for 24 hours? Who was the mysterious figure that multiple witnesses and the helicopter crew saw standing at the helm, calmly steering the boat through dangerous coral reefs with tattered sails? The official coroner's inquest would eventually propose a theory. They suggested that on the afternoon of April 15th, one of the men had gone to the edge of the boat to try and free a tangled fishing line or retrieve a dropped item. He had lost his balance and fallen into the ocean. The second man, seeing his friend in the water, had rushed to help him, but had also fallen overboard. The third man, panic-stricken, would have tried to steer the boat back to save them, but in his haste, he too fell into the water, leaving the catamaran to drift away on its own, while the three men tragically drowned in the ocean. But this theory had massive holes. If the men had all fallen overboard on the very first day, April 15th, then who was the pilot that multiple independent witnesses and a professional helicopter crew saw steering the boat on April 16th, 17th, and 18th? Why were the sails ripped to shreds if the boat had just been drifting? And why was the engine still running and the coffee still fresh when Corey Benson boarded the boat on April 20th? To this day, the families of Des, Jim, and Peter have never received any real answers. The three men, and whatever truly happened to them out on the water, remain lost to the sea, leaving behind one of the most baffling maritime mysteries in modern history. We have to look closely at how the initial investigations into these cases unfolded, because the details are where the truth always hides. In the case of the Athry ghost crash, the Surrey police were faced with an absolute impossibility. When they first processed the scene, they found that the registration of the car matched a 1994 Vauxhall Astra. This was a car that had been registered to Christopher Brian Chandler, who had been missing since July. The area where the car was found was a steep decline, about 20 yards off the main road, completely enveloped by dense underbrush, nettles, and mature trees. It was a location that was completely invisible to any passing vehicle, even during the bright daylight hours. And so, when the police department first received those calls on December 11th, they were expecting to find a fresh accident scene. The callers had been incredibly descriptive. One caller, a truck driver who had been traveling south on the A3, told the dispatchers that he had seen a dark hatchback lose control, slide sideways down the embankment, and disappear into the trees with its headlights still shining brightly. Another caller, a woman driving a sedan, reported that she had to swerve to avoid the same erratic vehicle just seconds before it left the road. She described the sound of the tires screeching and the violent impact as the car hit the tree line. But the problem was, when the officers actually reached the vehicle on foot, they found a scene that had been undisturbed for months. The car's battery was completely dead, and the engine block was cold and rusted. The tires were deflated, and thick vines had grown up through the wheel wells, wrapping themselves around the axles. Silt and dead leaves had accumulated on the hood and roof, forming a layer of organic debris that had clearly taken months to build up. The interior of the car was damp and covered in mold. There was absolutely no way that this vehicle had been driven on the highway that night, let alone crashed just minutes before the police arrived. At this point, the investigators were forced to look at the skeletal remains on the ground. The body was lying outside the open passenger door, partially covered by leaves and dirt that had naturally fallen over the preceding months. The forensic pathologist who examined the remains noted that there were no signs of trauma inflicted by another person. The bones showed fractures that were completely consistent with a high-speed vehicle impact, including broken ribs and a fractured collarbone. The decay of the soft tissue was extensive, indicating that the body had been exposed to the elements, insects, and small animals for approximately 5 months. This timeline matched perfectly with the date of Christopher's disappearance on July 16th. It turns out the police's initial theory that Christopher had gone on the run to escape his robbery charge was technically correct in terms of his motivation, but tragically wrong in terms of his fate. Christopher had indeed been trying to flee the area, but his escape was cut short on that very first night. He had been driving down the A3 in the middle of the night, likely speeding and paranoid that he was being followed, when he lost control of his vehicle and crashed into the dense woods. The impact had likely thrown him toward the passenger side, or he had managed to crawl out of the open door in a desperate attempt to find help before collapsing and dying in the dark forest. Because the woods were so dense, his car and his body remained hidden just yards from one of the busiest highways in England, completely unnoticed by the thousands of drivers who passed by every single day. But the problem was, this did not explain the calls on December 11th. The Surrey police maintained that the reports of a reckless driver and a crash that night were simply a bizarre coincidence. They argued that a different, unidentified vehicle must have been driving erratically on the highway, veered off the road, and then somehow recovered and drove away, leaving no tracks behind. But the callers had been very specific about the exact location of the crash. They had pointed the police directly to the spot where Christopher's car had been sitting for 5 months. It was almost as if a spectral reenactment of the crash had occurred, a phantom event that forced the authorities to finally look into the woods and find the young man who had been missing for half a year, allowing his family to finally have some closure. When we look at the tragedy in northern France, we see a similarly baffling sequence of events that initially pointed toward a terrible crime. On the afternoon of August 3rd, 2017, the small village was completely cordoned off by the local gendarmerie. The news that Lucien Perrault and Olivier Boudin had been found dead on the patio had sent shockwaves through the community. Because they were so well liked and had no known enemies, the villagers could not comprehend what had happened. The initial investigation focused heavily on the physical evidence found on the red and white checkered tablecloth. The police found the open bottle of red wine, which was half empty, 2 glasses, a partially eaten baguette, a plate of local cheese, and the remains of the grilled beef ribs. There was also a can of white beans that had been opened and partially consumed. Because there were no visible signs of violence on either Lucien or Olivier, the detectives immediately suspected that the men had been poisoned. And so, the police collected all the foodstuffs from the table and sent them under tight security to the forensic laboratories in Paris. The primary suspect was botulism, a highly potent neurotoxin produced by the bacterium Clostridium botulinum, which can thrive in improperly preserved or expired canned goods. If a person consumes food contaminated with botulism, the toxin quickly attacks their nervous system, causing paralysis, respiratory failure, and death within a very short period of time. Because the men had been eating canned beans, this seemed like the most logical explanation for their simultaneous deaths. But the problem was, the laboratory analysis came back completely negative for botulism. The scientists also tested the wine, the cheese, the baguette, and the beef for other common poisons, such as arsenic, cyanide, strychnine, and modern pesticides. Again, every single test was negative. The food was perfectly safe to eat, and the wine was completely untainted. There was no chemical explanation for why these 2 men had died. At this point, the investigators were forced to wait for the results of the autopsies, which were performed at the Forensic Institute in Amiens. When the medical examiner completed his examination, the pieces of this bizarre puzzle finally started to fall into place, revealing a sequence of physical events that was almost too tragic to believe. The autopsy of 69-year-old Lucien Perrau revealed that his lungs were completely clear of any fluid or disease, but his trachea was entirely blocked. A large piece of tough grilled beef rib, measuring nearly 3 inches in length, was wedged tightly in his throat. Lucien had tried to swallow this massive piece of meat without chewing it. The pathologist noted that Lucien was missing almost all of his molars, which are the teeth responsible for grinding down tough food like meat. Because he lacked these teeth, and because he was eating quickly, he had swallowed the chunk of beef whole. It had immediately blocked his airway, preventing him from breathing or making any sound. He was experiencing acute asphyxiation, a terrifying state where the brain is rapidly starved of oxygen. Next, the medical examiner performed the autopsy on 38-year-old Olivier Boudin. Unlike Lucien, Olivier's airway was completely clear, and there was no food in his trachea. However, his heart showed signs of a massive acute myocardial infarction. Olivier had a congenital heart condition known as cardiomegaly, which is a pathological enlargement of the heart muscle. While people with this condition can live relatively normal lives with proper medication and monitoring, their hearts are extremely vulnerable to sudden, massive spikes in blood pressure and adrenaline, and so the reconstruction of their final moments became painfully clear. Lucien and Olivier were sitting at the table, enjoying their dinner and the music playing from the radio. Lucien took a large bite of the beef rib, failed to chew it properly due to his missing teeth, and attempted to swallow it. The meat became lodged in his throat, and he began to choke violently, clutching his chest and throat, his face turning blue as he struggled for air. Olivier, sitting directly across from him, saw his best friend and father figure suddenly suffocating and thrashing in his chair. Olivier was instantly seized with an overwhelming wave of panic and terror. The sudden shock of seeing his friend dying caused a massive instantaneous release of adrenaline into Olivier's bloodstream. His heart rate skyrocketed and his blood pressure surged. For a normal, healthy heart, this would have been a standard fight-or-flight response. But for Olivier's enlarged and fragile heart, it was a lethal blow. The cardiac muscle simply could not handle the sudden, violent surge of pressure. His heart went into ventricular fibrillation and seized up completely. Olivier suffered a massive heart attack, collapsed backward onto the grass, and died within seconds. Lucian, who was still desperately struggling to dislodge the meat from his throat, was now left completely alone. He had watched his younger friend suddenly collapse onto the ground, unable to help him. Lucian had no way to perform the Heimlich maneuver on himself, and without anyone there to assist him or call for help, he simply sat in his chair, losing consciousness as his brain was starved of oxygen until he finally passed away. Fast forward to the next morning, when their neighbor Marie looked out her second-floor window. She saw Lucian sitting at the table and Olivier lying on the grass, and she assumed they had just had a long night of heavy drinking and were sleeping it off. It was only hours later, when the hot midday sun failed to wake them, that she realized the horrifying truth. The two best friends, who had found such comfort and companionship in each other's company, had been taken away in a matter of minutes by a cruel physical chain reaction of events. Now, when we look at the mystery of the Kaz-2, the details of the investigation are even more baffling. The 35-foot catamaran was designed and built to be one of the safest, most stable vessels on the water. Catamarans have twin hulls, which makes them incredibly resistant to tipping over, even in rough seas. The vessel was equipped with state-of-the-art navigation systems, life jackets, an emergency position indicating radio beacon, and a fully functional marine radio. When the rescue officer, Corey Benson, boarded the boat on April 20th, he was stepping onto a vessel that was fully operational. The boat's GPS was still active, and when investigators analyzed the recorded data, they were able to reconstruct the exact path the Kaz-2 had taken since its departure from Airlie Beach on April 15th. The GPS data showed that the boat had traveled along the planned coastal route for the first few hours of the trip, just as Jim's video had shown. But then, around 2 p.m. on April 15th, the GPS recorded a sudden, sharp 90-degree turn to the northeast. The boat began sailing directly away from the coast out into the deep, open waters of the Coral Sea. This turn was made at a speed of about 6 knots, and the boat maintained this heading for several miles. But the problem was, there was absolutely no reason for the crew to make this turn. Des Batten was a highly experienced sailor who was deeply familiar with the dangers of the open ocean, and he had been adamant about staying close to the shore. Furthermore, the GPS showed that after sailing out into the open water for several hours, the boat made another series of turns, eventually doubling back and returning to the vicinity of Champagne Bay on April 16th. This matched perfectly with the testimonies of the witnesses. Isabel Wheeler had seen the boat make that sharp turn on April 15th, and the two other witnesses had seen it sailing in circles in the exact same area on April 16th. But why would 3 experienced sailors spend 24 hours sailing in circles, violating their own safety rules without ever radioing for help or using their satellite phone? And then there was the sighting by the fishermen on April 17th. They saw the boat navigating through a highly dangerous coral reef system. The sails were torn to shreds, indicating that the boat had been battered by strong winds or had been improperly handled. Yet, the fishermen were certain that they saw a man standing at the helm, calmly steering the boat through the reefs. The pilot looked completely in control, steering the vessel around the shallow obstacles with expert precision. This was confirmed again on April 18th by the crew of the Coast Watch helicopter. They also saw the boat with its damaged sails, and they also saw a figure at the helm steering the boat through the treacherous waters. They tried to make contact over the radio, but they received no response. At this point, the investigators were faced with a massive contradiction. If the 3 men had fallen overboard and drowned on the very first day of the trip, as the official coroner's inquest would later suggest, then who was the person steering the boat on April 16th, 17th, and 18th? Who was the pilot who navigated the vessel through miles of dangerous shallow coral reefs with tattered sails without ever responding to radio calls or setting off the emergency beacon? When Corey Benson boarded the boat on April 20th, he found that the engine was still running, idling quietly in neutral. The GPS was on, and there was a cold but half-filled mug of coffee sitting on the table. A t-shirt was neatly folded on a chair with a pair of reading glasses resting on top of it. In the cabin, there were plates of food set out on the counter, and a laptop computer was open and running. All of the men's wallets, cash, passports, and life jackets were sitting in their lockers, completely untouched. The official coroner's theory was that one of the men had gone to the transom of the boat to try and free a tangled fishing line or retrieve a dropped item. He had lost his balance and fallen into the water. The second man, seeing his friend in the water, had rushed to help him, but had also fallen overboard. The third man, panic-stricken, would have tried to steer the boat back to save them, but in his haste, he too fell into the water, leaving the catamaran to drift away on its own, while the three men tragically drowned in the ocean. But this theory simply could not explain the physical evidence. If the men had all fallen overboard on April 15th, then who was the person seen steering the boat for the next 3 days? How did the boat navigate through miles of dangerous coral reefs without crashing if there was no one on board? And why was the engine still running and the coffee still sitting on the table 5 days later? If the boat had been drifting unmanned for 5 days, the engine would have run out of fuel, and the coffee would have evaporated or been knocked over by the movement of the waves. The families of Des, Jim, and Peter were left with a haunting, unresolved mystery. They had watched their loved ones set off on a dream vacation, completely happy and healthy, only for their boat to be found completely empty just a few days later, with all of their belongings untouched. Despite an extensive search and a detailed investigation, no trace of the three men was ever found, and their disappearance remains one of the most baffling maritime mysteries in modern history. Each of these three cases leaves us with a profound sense of unease. They remind us that the world is full of strange, unpredictable forces, and that sometimes the line between the living and the dead, the past and the present, is far more fragile than we would ever like to admit. Whether it is a ghost car reenacting a tragic crash from 5 months in the past, a freak physical chain reaction that takes the lives of two best friends in a matter of minutes, or a perfectly functional catamaran floating empty in the vast ocean with its engine still running, these stories show us that the truth is often far stranger than any fiction we could ever write. When we think about Christopher Brian Chandler, we are left with the image of a young man who spent his final months hiding from the world, only for his resting place to be revealed by a mysterious event that defies physical explanation. His family was able to finally lay him to rest, but the question of who was driving that car on December 11th will never be answered. For Lucien Perrault and Olivier Boudin, their lives were defined by a deep, unlikely friendship that brought warmth and meaning to their final years. Their sudden, simultaneous deaths were not the result of a violent crime or a malicious act, but rather a tragic physical coincidence that joined them in death just as they had been joined in life. And for the families of Des Batten, Jim Tunstead, and Peter Tunstead, the ocean remains a vast, silent vault that holds the secret of their loved ones' final moments. The Caz-2 continues to drift in the memories of those who knew them, a beautiful white catamaran sailing forever into the unknown, leaving behind only tattered sails and unanswered questions. The investigations have long since closed, the official reports have been filed away in dusty archives, and the locations where these events took place have returned to their quiet, normal routines. The A3 highway is still crowded with daily commuters driving past the trees where Christopher's car once sat. The small village in northern France still enjoys its quiet summer evenings, though the patio next to Marie's window remains empty. And the beautiful blue waters off the coast of Australia still draw sailors and fishermen from all over the world who look out over the horizon and wonder what truly happened to the crew of the Caz-2. These cases remind us of the fragility of our everyday lives. We plan our journeys, we gather with our friends, we set sail on our adventures, completely unaware of the invisible threads of fate that are constantly moving around us. And when those threads collide, they can create mysteries that will haunt us for generations, leaving us to search the dark woods, the silent backyards, and the vast open seas for answers that may never come. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. Just after midnight on June 17th, 1939, a low murmur began to build on a quiet street in the city of Versailles, France. The street itself was unremarkable, lined with plain buildings, but on this particular night, it was becoming the center of a strange and growing spectacle. People were starting to gather, arriving in small groups, their voices a mixture of nervous excitement and quiet dread. They stood in clusters on the cobblestones, their faces illuminated by the occasional gas lamp, all eyes fixed on one specific building. It was the Saint-Pierre prison, a stone structure that held one of the most infamous men in all of France. The atmosphere in the crowd was electric, a kind of dark energy you could almost feel in the air. Everyone knew exactly why they were there. They knew what they were about to witness, an event that hadn't been seen in that region for a very long time. But even with that knowledge, there was a heavy sense of anticipation. It was a morbid curiosity that had drawn them out of their beds and into the cool night air. Some people in the crowd were trying to cope with the tension by turning it into a social event. They passed around flasks of alcohol, their laughter a little too loud, their jokes a little too forced. They were trying to create a festive mood as if they were waiting for a parade to start. But others were much more subdued. They stood silently, their arms crossed, their expressions grim. They were there not for entertainment, but to see what they believed was justice, a final, definitive end to a chapter of terror that had gripped the country. The man inside the prison was Eugene Weidmann, a 31-year-old German national who had been convicted of multiple murders. His crimes were brutal, calculated, and driven by greed, and his trial had been a media sensation. He and his small gang had preyed on tourists visiting Paris, luring them to a secluded villa with the promise of a good investment or a sightseeing trip, only to rob and kill them. The story of his last victim, a young American dancer named Jean de Coven, had been particularly heartbreaking and had sealed his fate in the public consciousness. So for many in the crowd, this night was about closure. Sometime between 1 and 2 in the morning, a set of heavy doors on the prison building creaked open. The crowd instantly went quiet. Every head turned. A group of men emerged, all dressed in identical dark uniforms. They didn't speak a word to the crowd or even acknowledge their presence. They moved with a purpose that was both unnerving and fascinating. The crowd, which had been pressing forward, instinctively began to back away, creating a wide open space in front of the prison. These men carried with them pieces of heavy lumber and a collection of tools. They walked to the center of the cleared space and, without any spoken commands, they began to work. They were there to build the instrument of justice, the very reason everyone had gathered. They were building a guillotine. The crowd watched, mesmerized. They wanted to get a closer look, to see the grim machine take shape, but a sense of fear or perhaps respect for the process kept them at a distance. They formed a silent half-moon around the workers. The men moved with incredible efficiency, a seamless choreography born from practice. It was clear that this was not the first time they had performed this task. Every movement was precise, economical, and devoid of any emotion. It was just a job to them. One man would place a beam on the ground, and another would be right there with the hardware to fasten it. They assembled the 2 tall upright posts, the bois de justice or woods of justice that would guide the blade. Then came the heavy angled blade itself attached to a weighted block called a mouton. It was hoisted to the top of the posts and locked into place, gleaming under the streetlights. They assembled the bascule, the tilting plank on which the condemned would be strapped, and the lunette, the wooden collar that would clamp around the neck. By about 3 in the morning, the structure was complete. It stood there, tall and imposing, a skeletal silhouette against the night sky. The workers placed a large wicker basket next to it and a smaller metal bucket directly under where the blade would fall. Then, just as silently as they had arrived, they packed up their leftover tools and materials, turned around, and disappeared back inside the prison, closing the heavy doors behind them. With the guillotine now standing ready, the crowd's restlessness grew. The initial nervous energy began to curdle into impatience. They knew the next time those doors opened, the main event would begin. The show they had all come to see was imminent. But minutes turned into an hour, and then longer. The prison remained silent. The crowd started to murmur again, wondering what the delay was. Everyone knew that public executions were supposed to happen before dawn. The official policy was to conduct them in darkness, or at the very least, in the dim light of early morning. This was done to maintain a degree of somberness and, more practically, to prevent the press from getting clear photographs or film of the event. Officials didn't want the proceedings to turn into a media circus. But for some unknown reason, things were being held up inside the prison. As the delay stretched on, the crowd grew louder. The more boisterous members, fueled by alcohol, started shouting and jeering. The atmosphere was losing its grim solemnity and was taking on the ugly feel of a mob. Then, around 4:45 in the morning, a soft gray light began to appear on the eastern horizon. The sun was coming up. The delay had been too long. And with the daylight came the press in full force. Photographers jockeyed for the best positions, setting up their tripods and aiming their large cameras at the prison doors. Newsreel cameramen were there too, ready to capture the entire event on film. At this point, most people in the crowd assumed it was over. They figured the authorities had missed their window and would call it off. Surely, they wouldn't proceed in broad daylight in front of all these cameras. But they were wrong. At exactly 4:50 in the morning, the prison doors swung open one last time. Standing in the threshold was Eugene Weidman. His arms were bound tightly behind his back. He was wearing a simple white shirt, and the collar had been carefully folded down, tucked inside, leaving his neck completely bare and exposed. On either side of him stood a grim-faced prison guard. They pulled him forward, out into the morning light, and towards the waiting crowd. Behind him, the executioners, dressed head to toe in black, filed out and took up their positions around the guillotine. As Weidman was led out, the crowd erupted. The sound was a wild, chaotic roar. People were shrieking, howling, and laughing. They pointed at him, booing and shouting insults. The scene had descended into a complete frenzy, a bloodthirsty spectacle that no one had anticipated. Eugene Weidman kept his head down the entire time. He seemed to be making a conscious effort not to look at the jeering crowd, and certainly not at the towering machine that awaited him. He shuffled forward, his steps guided by the two guards. They turned him and walked him directly towards the base of the guillotine. When they reached it, the black-clad executioners took over. They moved with the same swift, impersonal efficiency as the men who had built the structure. They grabbed Weidman and maneuvered him onto the tilting plank. They slid him forward on his stomach, pushing him along the wooden platform until his head passed through the semicircular opening of the lunette. Another piece of wood slid into place, clamping his neck securely. He was now positioned perfectly, his neck directly beneath the massive, angled blade that dangled high above him. His head was positioned over the metal bucket on the ground, which would have been the last thing he saw. At this point, the crowd was at a fever pitch. Their shouts reached a crescendo. One of the executioners, the chief executioner, Jules-Henri Desfourneaux, calmly reached out and pulled a lever. There was a sharp metallic click, followed by a swishing sound as the heavy blade was released. It came soaring down the tracks with incredible speed. In less than a second, it was over. His head was severed from his body. The head fell cleanly into the metal bucket below. Immediately, the executioners pushed his now lifeless torso off the plank and into the large wicker basket that had been placed beside the guillotine. The guards and executioners then gathered up Weidmann's remains, the basket, and the bucket, and carried everything back inside the prison. The whole procedure, from the moment Weidmann appeared at the door to the moment his body was taken away, lasted only a matter of minutes. As the prison doors closed, the crowd, instead of dispersing, went wild with a strange celebratory energy. They cheered and then surged forward, running up to the guillotine. They began dabbing their scarves and handkerchiefs in the pool of Eugene Weidmann's blood that had collected on the cobblestones. They were taking home a souvenir from the execution. It was a ghastly medieval scene, and because the sun had been out, it was all captured in stark detail. The photographers had their pictures, and the newsreel cameras had their film. In the days that followed, the headlines all across France were not about the execution of a notorious killer, but about the shocking and barbaric behavior of the crowd. The photographs and news reports painted a picture of a bloodthirsty mob cheering and celebrating a man's death. It made France look uncivilized, and the story became an international embarrassment. The French president at the time, Albert Lebrun, was said to be absolutely horrified by the reports and the accompanying images of the so-called hysterical public. He and other French leaders decided that the spectacle of public executions had no place in a modern society. They concluded that these events did not serve as a deterrent to crime, but instead only encouraged the basest and most violent instincts in the public. And so, a decision was made. From that point forward, there would be no more public executions in France. The guillotine would continue to be the state's method of capital punishment for several more decades, but its use would be hidden away from public view, carried out behind the high, cold walls of prisons. Eugene Weidmann's execution on June 17, 1939, was the very last time the public would ever witness the guillotine in action. There's a strange and unsettling footnote to the science of death by guillotine. For centuries, there have been anecdotal reports and debates about whether the head remains conscious even for a few moments after being separated from the body. It's said that consciousness can persist for about 10 to 12 seconds. There are numerous historical accounts where, after the blade fell, an executioner would pick up the severed head and yell the condemned person's name. In some of these cases, it was reported that the head's eyes would turn towards the sound of the voice and the eyelids would blink, or the mouth would try to form words. This would continue for several seconds before the lack of oxygen finally shut down the brain and all signs of life vanished. The thought that a person could be aware of their own decapitation, even for a fleeting moment, adds another layer of grimness to an already brutal process. The images captured on that morning in Versailles served as a stark and permanent record of the end of an era, a final, public performance of state-sanctioned death that ultimately repulsed the very society it was meant to serve. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On the afternoon of the 2nd of August 1998, a 48-year-old man named Mike Turner paused on the side of a mountain. He was tall, 6'6", and built like a man who spent a lot of time outdoors. He stood in a small cluster of trees about 11,000 feet up inside a vast and rugged area in Wyoming known as the Fitzpatrick Wilderness. He pulled a water bottle from his backpack and took a long, refreshing sip. The air was thin up there, and staying hydrated was crucial. The Fitzpatrick Wilderness is one of those places that almost looks unreal. It's like nature decided to put all of its most dramatic features into one single location. You have these enormous 13,000-foot mountain peaks, their tops permanently covered in snow and ice. You have ancient glaciers inching their way down the slopes. And then, right at the base of these imposing mountains, there are these incredibly lush green meadows They're filled with tall grass, wildflowers, and streams that cut through the landscape like silver ribbons. It's absolutely picturesque. In fact, some of the photos from this area look so perfect that you'd swear they were fake. But the reason the Fitzpatrick Wilderness was so beautiful and pristine was because it was almost completely untouched by people. It was just so incredibly difficult to get to. The only folks who really ventured deep into this surreal landscape were experienced outdoorsmen, people who knew how to handle themselves in the wild, people exactly like Mike Turner. It took a lot of skill and knowledge just to navigate the terrain and survive out there. It's a very, very rugged place. And Mike wasn't just content to stick to the marked trails. He wanted to experience the true raw nature of this place. So, on this trip, he was hiking completely off-trail, navigating through a totally remote part of the wilderness that wasn't even marked on any map. Now, to anyone who hasn't done much map and compass navigation, this might sound incredibly reckless. And, in a way, it is. But some people just have a natural talent for it. They have an innate ability to understand their position based on the terrain features around them. When you combine that natural skill with proper training and years of experience, you get someone who can confidently navigate through the most remote backcountry with just a map and a compass. Mike was one of those people. For him, walking off trail in a place this remote was practically routine. Mike wasn't a full-time professional adventurer, though. This was his passion, his escape. His day job was being a reverend at a Christian church back in Idaho. He had been leading his congregation for over 10 years, and he absolutely loved it. He loved the people in his church, and his family was deeply involved too. His wife Diane and their 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, were all a huge part of the church community. It was a wonderful life, but being a reverend was also a demanding job. It came with a lot of responsibility and a lot of stress. And so, Mike had found a way to cope with that growing stress. He would go hiking. He found, somewhat ironically, that he felt closer to God when he was out in nature, surrounded by the wilderness, than he ever did while preaching inside his church. He saw the natural world as this grand, incredible gift from God, and you can just imagine him standing there in the middle of the Fitzpatrick Wilderness, looking at this unbelievable terrain. It was the kind of beauty that makes you believe something greater must have created it. So, on this particular day, as Mike stood sipping his water 11,000 feet up on that mountainside, he was on the 4th day of a 9-day solo hike. This trip was something he had been meticulously planning for over a year. It was meant to be the ultimate escape, a true spiritual journey. Now, even though Mike was a highly skilled hiker and survivalist, he knew that any long solo hike came with its own unique set of risks. The biggest one, of course, is that if you get into trouble, you're all alone. There's no one there to help you. So, you have to have a solid plan for any emergency. And Mike did. He had spent the better part of a year mapping out the entire 60-mile off-trail route he planned to take through the wilderness. He drew out his path on a topographical map, marking down coordinates and estimating where he would be on each of the 9 days. He gave this detailed map to his wife Diane, who was also an enthusiastic hiker and understood the plan. He told her, on the 9th day, you'll meet me at this exact spot at the end of the 60 miles. Be there at noon, and I'll be there waiting. But that well-laid plan had already changed. On that 4th day, as Mike stood there on the mountain, only he knew that he was no longer on the route he had given to his wife. He had no way to communicate this change to anyone. Back in 1998, cell phones were still primitive, and there was certainly no service in the middle of the Fitzpatrick Wilderness. If he deviated from the plan, he was the only person in the world who would know. The reason Mike decided to alter his course made perfect sense, though. Even though he was technically on a solo hike, he wasn't completely alone. He had the family dog with him, a good-natured black lab mix named Andy. Andy loved hiking just as much as Mike did. But over the previous day and into this fourth day of the trip, they had been at very high elevations, around 13,000 feet. They had crossed several icy patches on the mountain, and Mike noticed that the jagged ice was starting to take a toll on Andy's paws. They were getting raw and sensitive. That morning, Mike had seen Andy whimpering and struggling to keep up. Normally, Andy was full of energy, running ahead and exploring everything. Seeing his dog in pain, Mike knew he had to make a change. He looked at his map and saw that his planned route for the next few days would take them over even more mountains and more ice. He knew Andy wouldn't be able to handle it. His paws would just get worse. So he made the decision to change his route. He would skirt around the base of the mountains, avoiding the highest, iciest elevations. This new path was definitely going to take him longer, but it would eventually lead him to the same final destination, that same pickup spot where Diane and his family would be waiting. Mike understood the risks of what he was doing. By deviating from his route, he knew that his family would have no idea where he was. If something went wrong, a search party would be looking for him in a completely different area. He also knew that this new, longer route meant he wouldn't make it to the pickup spot on time. He wasn't going to be there at noon on the 9th day as planned. It would probably be the 10th day, or maybe even later. But Mike had prepared for this kind of possibility. He had packed extra food and supplies specifically for a situation where he might need to extend his journey. He felt confident that even though it was a big risk to take a path that nobody knew he was on, he could handle it without any problems. So, after Mike finished his sip of water, he pulled a small bowl from his pack. It was Andy's bowl. He poured some of his water into it and placed it on the ground. Andy limped over and began to lap at the water. As the dog drank, Mike looked down and saw his tail starting to wag happily. Seeing how much better Andy seemed already, Mike felt a sense of relief. He was sure he had made the right decision. Taking this secondary route was definitely the way to go. But as Mike waited for his dog to finish drinking, Andy suddenly stopped. He lifted his head, his ears perked up. He had sensed something. And then, before Mike could react or call him back, Andy just took off, running straight into the nearby trees and disappearing from sight. Now, Andy was a playful dog and sometimes ran off like this on their hikes, but this was different. Remember, Mike was deep in the backcountry and he had just deviated from his planned route. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes. He needed to be absolutely sure of his location and his heading at all times. If Andy just went rogue and he had to go chasing after him, the risk of getting turned around or lost was high. Plus, there was always the chance that Andy had sensed a large predator, like a bear or a mountain lion. So, Mike quickly grabbed the water bowl, shoved it in his pack, and took off running into the trees after his dog. He pushed through the dense branches and emerged on the other side. And when he did, he was suddenly hit with this incredible, breathtaking view. He was on the edge of a huge open clearing on the side of the mountain. The clearing sloped steeply down towards a pristine blue lake below. And the entire clearing was filled with massive boulders. These weren't small rocks. They were the size of small cars scattered everywhere. It looked like, over centuries, the mountain had eroded and huge chunks of rock had rolled down and settled in this one spot. The boulders were so numerous and so tightly packed that you couldn't even see the ground. The only way to get across this clearing was to climb on top of the boulders and jump from one to the next. And that's where he saw his dog. Andy was already making his way across the boulder field, heading down towards the lake. Clearly, that's what he had sensed. He wanted a drink or maybe a swim. Mike knew that to get to his dog and get them back on track, he would have to follow him across this treacherous field of rocks. He tried calling for Andy one more time, yelling his name, hoping he would stop and come back. But Andy was on his own mission, focused only on the water. Resigned to the situation, Mike took a deep breath, climbed onto the first massive boulder, and began carefully jumping from rock to rock, making his way towards his dog. 1 week later, on the afternoon of August 9th, Mike's wife, Diane, stood at the head of a trail called the Big Sandy Trail. This was the designated meeting spot. This was where Mike had told her he would be. She was there with her 3 kids and some close family friends. As Diane stood there, she kept anxiously checking her watch. Mike was late. And not just a few minutes late, he was a full 24 hours late. He was supposed to have been there at noon on August 8th. Now it was the afternoon of the 9th, and there was still no sign of him. But you have to remember, Mike was a man who did things like this fairly often. He was incredibly competent out in the wild. Everyone who knew him, especially Diane, understood that when he went on these long journeys, there was always some variability in his return time. Even though Mike had confidently said, "I'll be there on the 8th at noon," Diane and their friends all had this unspoken understanding that realistically, he might be several hours or even a day late. And that was okay. Things happen in the wilderness. You might encounter bad weather or find a more difficult section of trail than you expected. So, the day before, on the 8th, when Mike didn't show up at noon, people were anxious, but they weren't panicking. They waited through the afternoon and into the evening. But now, a full 24 hours had passed, and there was still absolutely no trace of him. The worry was starting to set in for real. Diane and her kids and their friends were getting very concerned. In fact, before Mike had left on this trip, he and Diane had discussed this exact scenario. He had given her a clear instruction. He told her that if he didn't show up by 4 p.m. on the 9th, so a full 24 hours and 4 hours after his expected arrival, that was the trigger point. At that time, she should call the authorities and assume something was seriously wrong. That was the signal to send out a search party. So, Diane is standing there at the trailhead on the 9th, checking her watch. Soon enough, it's 4 p.m. No Mike. 4:05. 4:10. 4:15. Still nothing. And even though she knew what her husband had told her to do, she just couldn't bring herself to make that call. She felt like it was such a huge step. Organizing a search and rescue operation in a place like the Fitzpatrick Wilderness is a massive effort. It's incredibly expensive and involves dozens of people. She had this nagging feeling that the very second she called the authorities, Mike would come strolling out of the woods with a big smile, a wild story to tell, and a sincere apology for being late. So she convinced herself to wait a little longer. She told everyone, "Let's just give him one more day. I'm sure he's going to show up." But the next morning, on August 10th, there was still no sign of Mike. That's when Diane knew she couldn't wait any longer. She went to the authorities and officially reported her husband missing. And just as she had expected, a massive search was launched immediately. But you have to keep a critical fact in mind here. Neither Diane, nor the search teams, nor anyone else in the world besides Mike had any idea that he had altered his path. They were all operating based on the detailed map he had left behind. They were searching a huge 60-mile stretch of wilderness, but they were searching in the wrong place. Even under the best of conditions, finding a single person in a landscape that vast and rugged is like finding a needle in a haystack. The terrain is so difficult, with dense forests, steep canyons, and rocky slopes. There are areas that are completely inaccessible from the ground and obscured from view from the air. There are predators out there. It's an incredibly dangerous environment to be searching in. And again, they didn't know he wasn't even on that path anymore. So, despite helicopters crisscrossing the skies, teams on horseback covering miles of terrain, and hundreds of volunteers on foot combing the area, nobody found a single trace of Mike Turner. After 2 long, agonizing weeks with this huge search effort producing absolutely nothing, the authorities had to make the difficult decision to call it off. For Mike's family, the news was unbelievably devastating. They were left with no answers, no closure, just the horrifying mystery of what could have happened to Mike. Then, 5 days after the official search was called off, on August 28th, a couple of backpackers were hiking through an area of the Fitzpatrick Wilderness. They were about 17 miles away from the last place anyone had officially seen Mike Turner, which was near the very beginning of his 9-day journey. These two backpackers were aware that a hiker was missing. There were flyers posted all over the towns surrounding the wilderness, at trailheads, in ranger stations. The flyers had a picture of Mike and his dog, Andy. So, they knew the story. As these two were sitting and taking a break, a black dog came stumbling out of the tree line. It was a black lab mix, and it was in terrible shape. It was totally emaciated, its ribs were showing, and it was covered in dirt and scratches. The dog was whimpering and looked like it was on its very last legs. It was Andy. The backpackers recognized him immediately from the flyers. They knew this was the missing dog. They carefully approached him, luring him closer with pieces of their granola bars. Andy, weak as he was, came up to them and gratefully ate the food they offered. They gave him water, which he drank thirstily. Thankfully, Andy would survive and eventually make a full recovery. As soon as they had Andy safely with them, the backpackers made their way out of the wilderness and contacted the authorities. The authorities then got in touch with Mike's family and told them the news. We found Andy. You can only imagine the absolute roller coaster of emotions that Mike Turner's family went through at that moment. On one hand, there was immense relief and joy that their beloved dog was alive. But, on the other hand, it reignited a desperate hope. If Andy made it out, maybe Mike was okay too. Maybe Andy could lead them to him. After all, Mike was a skilled survivalist. He had to be alive out there somewhere. So, after Andy was found, a second unofficial search was launched. This time, they would use Andy as their guide. Mike's family, along with some volunteers, took Andy back to the exact spot where the backpackers had found him. They let him off his leash and hoped that he would lead them back into the wilderness, back to where he had last seen Mike. As this new search with Andy began, a separate hiker was making his own way through a different part of the Fitzpatrick Wilderness. We'll call him Brian. Brian was not part of any search party. He was just on his own solo hiking trip. But he was also aware that Mike Turner was missing. Like the other backpackers, he had seen the missing person flyers at the trailhead before he started his own hike. So, the story was in the back of his mind. Brian hiked for several days, pushing deeper and deeper into the rugged expanse. Eventually, he reached a dense cluster of trees high up on the side of a mountain at about 11,000 feet. He walked through the trees, and when he emerged on the other side, he saw it. Sprawled out in front of him, sloping down to a lake, was the unbelievable boulder field. The sight of it practically took his breath away. But that wasn't what really caught his attention. As he stood there, taking in the incredible view of the boulders and the mountains in the distance, he noticed something else. There was a man. He was sitting on a rock, fairly far across the boulder field. The man had his back to Brian and was just sitting there, perfectly still, staring out at the lake. Remember, this was the middle of nowhere. Brian hadn't seen another person for days and certainly wasn't expecting to. So, naturally, his first thought was that he needed to go over and check on this person, make sure they were okay. At the very least, he was curious to talk to them. It's a rare thing to come across another human being in a place this remote. So, Brian began carefully making his way across the boulder field, walking towards the strange, silent figure to see what was going on. That man sitting on the rock was the missing hiker, Mike Turner. And Mike Turner had an incredible, heartbreaking story to tell. To understand that story, we have to go back 29 days. We have to go back to the moment when Andy the dog took off running from Mike. Mike had chased him through the trees and emerged to see the vast boulder field and his dog making his way towards the lake. He had climbed onto that first rock and started his journey across. Mike hopped carefully from boulder to boulder. At first, everything was going fine. He was about halfway across the huge field, calling out to Andy to stay put, when he reached one particularly large boulder. When he jumped onto it, he felt it shift beneath his feet. It was unstable. It began to wobble. Instinctively, Mike tried to leap off the wobbly boulder and onto another stable-looking one right next to it. But as he jumped, he slightly undershot his landing. He didn't land squarely on top of the second boulder. Instead, his feet hit the side of it and he slipped, falling down into the small gap between the two massive rocks. The fall didn't hurt him. He was just standing on the ground now, in this narrow space. But unfortunately, the wobbly 800-pound boulder right behind him didn't just stop wobbling. The momentum from his jump caused it to roll forward just a few inches until it came to a rest against the second boulder, the one he had just tried to jump onto. The two giant rocks were now pressed together, and Mike was caught between them. Critically, the impact didn't crush him or break any bones. It was a strange, freak occurrence. The wobbly boulder had what looked like a U-shaped cutout on its face. It was just a natural indentation in the rock. And by some unbelievable coincidence, the second boulder, the one in front of him, also had a similar U-shaped divot on its face. When the two boulders came together, Mike happened to be standing in the exact position where those two cutouts perfectly aligned around his ankles. They closed around him like a pair of giant granite shackles. They pinned his ankles together so tightly that he couldn't pull his legs up and out. The space was just big enough to hold his legs, but not big enough to let them go. He was literally anchored to the ground. But again, he was completely unharmed. His legs weren't broken, he wasn't bleeding, nothing. He just could not move. Mike would have known instantly that he was in very serious trouble. He couldn't move these 800-pound boulders. He was all by himself, except for his dog, who couldn't exactly help him lift tons of rock. Mike's mind immediately jumped into problem-solving mode. He had to find a way to move these boulders even just a millimeter. A single centimeter of space would be enough to free his feet. He wriggled out of his large backpack, and, one by one, he pulled out every piece of equipment he had. He used his metal camera tripod as a lever. He tried to jam his camp stove into the crack. He used every tool he had, trying with all his might to pry the massive boulders apart. But they wouldn't budge. Not even a fraction of an inch. After 2 exhausting hours of trying in vain to free himself, the grim reality began to dawn on him. He was not going to be able to get himself out. The only way he was leaving this spot was if someone found him and rescued him. Doing his best to stay calm and not panic, Mike pulled out the journal he had brought with him on the trip. He had intended to use it to document his spiritual journey, his thoughts on God and nature. Now it would become a record of his survival or his last days. He began to write, documenting exactly what had happened. He wrote about why he was in the boulder field, how he had been chasing Andy, and how he ended up trapped in these granite shackles. In his writing, it was also very clear that he was putting his faith in God to get him out of this. On that first day, just 2 hours into his ordeal, he wrote in his journal, "I am in your hands, Lord. I don't know what I may face." He was acknowledging the danger, but also affirming his faith that he would be helped through it. After writing that first entry, Mike turned his attention to survival. He stopped trying to move the boulders and started trying to make his situation as tolerable as possible to last as long as he could. He pulled out his blue sleeping bag and wrapped it around his upper body to insulate himself from the cold that he knew was coming. He got out his small camp stove. There was some snow still lingering in the shadows of the boulders within his reach. He began gathering it, putting it in his pot, and melting it to create drinking water. He even managed to pull the rain fly from his tent over the top of him to create a small shelter from the sun. He was essentially setting up a tiny stationary camp inside his rock prison. That first night must have been absolutely terrifying. Even though it had been over 100 degrees during the day, at that altitude, the temperatures dropped to near freezing at night. He was trapped, alone with his own thoughts, just hoping and praying that help would come. The next day, when Mike woke up, he wrote in his journal again. He started to detail his biggest fears. One of them was the possibility of having to have his legs amputated if he was rescued. He was worried about the damage that was being done from the lack of circulation. He wrote that he had enough food to last for at least a week, but his water situation was becoming critical. He only had 2 quarts of water left. The small patches of snow within his reach were almost gone, and his stove was running low on fuel. He was deeply worried about dehydration. And the irony was agonizing. He was only about 25 or 30 feet away from a huge, clear lake full of fresh water, but he couldn't get to it. On that second day, Mike made a desperate attempt. He tied a rope to his water bottle and tried to throw it into the lake, hoping to scoop up some water and pull it back to him. He threw it with all his strength, but it landed just short of the water's edge. He couldn't get it into the lake. Then, as he tried to drag the empty bottle back towards him, it got wedged between some other rocks just out of his reach. He couldn't move to dislodge it. So now he had lost his water bottle too. By the end of that second day, the tone of his journal entries began to change. He wasn't completely negative yet, but the grim reality was setting in. He wrote, "I wonder what's going to happen when I run out of water. I wonder what my urine will taste like if I mix it with crystal light." He was trying to make a dark joke, but it showed that he was beginning to understand just how serious his situation was. Nobody knew where he was. He was completely off his planned route. He had no idea if anyone was even looking for him yet. And he was about to run out of water. On the third day of being trapped, Mike wrote in his journal again. This time, his tone seemed a bit more optimistic, despite the fact that his water crisis was now a reality. He was down to his last few sips. But he wrote about how the whole purpose of this 9-day trip was to become closer to God, and he felt that, in a strange way, he had achieved that. He wrote that what he had wanted, a profound spiritual event, had happened, but in a way he never could have imagined. He felt that being trapped there had brought him closer to God than he had ever been. But you could still sense this underlying hope in his words. He believed he was going to get out of there. He was going to learn from this experience. He wrote about how he would never take stupid risks again, how he was going to be a better father, a better husband, a better reverend. He was determined to improve himself as a result of the suffering he was going through. However, over the next few days, as Mike continued to be trapped in those rocks with no sign of rescue, that optimism clearly began to fade. He started to write about being angry with God. He wondered if this was some kind of punishment for something he had done. He thought that maybe he had failed God in some way, and this was the consequence. You could feel the torment of this deeply spiritual man who couldn't understand how he could be in such a terrible position, praying constantly for help and receiving nothing. Unfortunately for Mike, his situation only got worse. On about the 5th or 6th day, as he lay wretchedly in his makeshift camp, he noticed that he had completely lost all feeling in his left leg. It was just numb, a dead weight attached to him. This sparked a new, very real fear inside of him, which he detailed in his journal. He knew now that his body was actively beginning to break down. And still, no help was coming. No divine intervention despite all his prayers. No rescuers, despite his family surely being worried by now. He was completely and utterly alone. In one of his entries around this time, Mike wrote something that is just devastating to read. It simply said, "So lonely. More than I imagined. I just can't fathom what that must have been like. To be trapped, uninjured but immobile, all alone in the vast wilderness, just slowly withering away. Knowing your family is out there somewhere and they have no idea what's happened to you. The mental torture he must have endured is almost beyond comprehension. And it just kept getting worse. On day 6 or 7, at some point, Mike dropped his journal. It fell just out of his reach. And because he couldn't move to get it back, he just picked up whatever other objects he could find and continued to write on them. He wrote in the margins of his pocket Bible. He wrote on the small instruction manual for his camp stove. And his writing on these items became more and more pessimistic and sad. He wrote about how intensely he regretted his decision to take the longer alternate route. He knew that decision had sealed his fate. Nobody would know where to look for him. He was filled with self-blame. He was still wrestling with his faith, wondering why God had abandoned him. This was a man who was losing his mind with regret, anguish, and a profound, crushing loneliness. But then, around the 8th or 9th day of being stuck, Mike's writing took another turn. Not only was it becoming more and more illegible, because he was literally dying at this point, but the subject of his writing changed. He was breaking down physically. He was exposed to the brutal sun all day and the freezing cold all night. He had no water left except for his own urine. He had no food left. He could barely hold a pen. But his writing began to focus entirely on his family, on his children. At this point, Mike must have known that the end was very near. And so, all he had left were the thoughts of his family. He began to wonder what his kids' lives would be like in the future, what they would become. The clear implication was that he knew he wouldn't be there to see it. In some of his last entries, it was obvious that Mike had found his way back to his faith. He was no longer angry or questioning God's plan. He was just ready. He was approaching God with open arms again. He wrote, "Fill me with peace, Lord. May my conditions not deny my love for you." And then he wrote, "I'm ready to die, though I'm missing my family." In his final entry, which must have been on the 10th day of his ordeal, Mike's writing was almost completely illegible. He was on death's door. But even though you can't make out most of the words, at the very end of this final entry, you can clearly see what he wrote. It says, "Love, Dad." It was his final goodbye to his family. Then Mike did one last thing. He took off his wedding band and carefully placed it on the flat surface of the rock next to him. He must have known that once he passed away and his body decomposed, the ring would fall from his finger and be lost forever among the rocks below. He wanted his family to have it. After placing the ring on the rock, he prepared to die. When Brian, the hiker, walked up to the man he saw sitting on the boulder, he realized almost immediately that it was Mike Turner. He recognized him from the missing person flyers he had seen before he began his hike. Knowing this was the man everyone was looking for, and knowing there was nothing he could do for him now, Brian respectfully covered him up. He found Mike's wallet, which contained his ID, and then, as fast as he possibly could, he began the long journey back to the trailhead to contact the authorities. It's a testament to just how remote this area was that it took Brian almost 3 full days of non-stop hiking to get back to civilization and make that call. And it would also turn out that Andy, the loyal family dog who was leading that second search, was indeed on the right track. Once the authorities knew where Mike had died, they compared it to the direction Andy had been leading his family. It was obvious that Andy was heading straight for that boulder field. He was a faithful dog, trying to go back and save his owner. He just wasn't going to get there in time. To close out this story, there's one more tragic detail. On the day that Mike left his home to begin his 9-day trek, after he had said goodbye to his wife Diane and their 3 beautiful children, a bouquet of flowers arrived at their house. It was a delivery that Mike had arranged. He knew they would arrive after he had already left for his trip. Attached to the bouquet was a simple note written to Diane. It just said, "Thank you for letting me live this adventure. Know that wherever I am and whatever I'm doing, I'm thinking of you. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Over the years, a lot of people have claimed they were abducted by aliens. And if we're being realistic, there's no real, tangible proof that any human has ever stepped foot on an extraterrestrial spacecraft or visited another dimension. What we have are these wild stories from people who claim it happened to them. And while a lot of these stories are very quickly dismissed as hoaxes, there's one abduction story that is almost universally seen as the most famous and maybe the most believable of all time. And that is the story of Travis Walton. What makes this case so different, so famous, is that unlike almost every other alien abduction story, which usually just boils down to one person's first-hand account, this one was different. This one had a full-scale police investigation. It had up to 16 separate lie detector tests that were given to Travis Walton himself, along with all the other witnesses who were there that day. And most importantly, it had a group of 6 other perfectly level-headed men who said they actually saw the abduction happen. These guys have stuck to their story, every single one of them, for over 40 years. They all passed their lie detector tests, and not one of them has ever changed their story. And you have to think, at some point, you might be tempted to change your story, because these men came under an incredible amount of scrutiny. This single event basically derailed most of their lives and their careers because everyone started labeling them as crazy people. They became famous, sure, but in all the worst ways. So you have all these different elements that make this story seem, well, strangely credible. Even if you don't believe it was an alien abduction, you still have to figure out how to explain it. How do you explain the past lie detector tests where they're talking about a UFO? How do you account for the fact that Travis Walton was genuinely missing for 5 full days with absolutely no idea where he was? And there was a massive search effort looking for him in the exact area where he would have been. There are just so many unanswered questions. But the story itself, the story of what the other men saw happen, and then Travis's own story about what happened to him after he was taken, it all makes for an absolutely incredible tale. It's been turned into books and movies, and even to this day, it remains one of, if not the, single most fascinating purported alien abduction stories ever told. By the year 1975, Travis Walton, who was 22 years old at the time, had built up a bit of a bad boy reputation in his small hometown of Snowflake, Arizona. He was the kind of guy who rode a loud Harley-Davidson motorcycle right through the middle of town. He was a wild bull rider, and he was a boxer. There was this one story that people told about Travis. He was out driving with his friends one day, and they were just going down this road when a huge bear suddenly jumped out of the woods. It landed right in the middle of the road and just stood there. And Travis, without even thinking about it, just leaps out of the moving car and starts chasing after this massive bear. He actually scared it back into the woods and then kept chasing it for a good ways. So, that was Travis. He was known as this kind of rebel, maybe a little bit of a problem child, but he was absolutely beloved by his friends. He was just one of those cool guys who did things his own way. Travis and the 6 other men he worked with were loggers. They would get contracts to go out and clear trees in a specific area. Now, these weren't a big-time operation with huge, heavy machinery. We're talking about chainsaws, regular saws, and axes. They were just these blue-collar, hard-working guys, and they would go out into the forest and clear patches of trees. That's what they did for a living. And it was a dangerous job. You're cutting down these enormous trees, and you're usually working pretty fast. You're operating dangerous equipment like chainsaws. Mike Rogers, who was the crew boss and was there on the day all this happened, he said in a number of interviews that the men he hired for these jobs had to be incredibly level-headed. They were not the kind of people you'd expect to come up with some fantastical story about an alien encounter. On the 5th of November, 1975, Mike Rogers and his crew got a new contract. They were supposed to clear out a huge 1,200-acre plot of land inside of the Sitgreaves National Forest. So Mike got his crew together. They all piled into the one pickup truck that Mike owned, and they headed out. Mike knew from the start that this was going to be a really, really difficult job. It was a massive area to cover, and he told his men right up front, "We're going to be working incredibly hard, so you need to expect long, full days." And so for the first 3 days of the job, even though they were working these extremely long hours and barely taking any breaks, they were still falling behind schedule. At the end of this third day, it was late. They had worked all day long, and every single one of them was just completely and totally exhausted. Finally, they decided to wrap it up for the night. They all piled back into Mike's truck, all 7 of them, and they started the long drive down the access road back towards the main road that would take them back to town. As they were driving, they weren't really talking about work anymore. They were mostly just joking around, talking about what they were going to do that night. And as they're driving down this road, and remember, it's heavily forested on both sides, they looked off to their right and they saw some lights in the forest. They all said in interviews later that they all noticed it, but at first, it didn't really stand out as anything strange or bad. It could have been anything, and they weren't really thinking about it. But as they kept driving down this road, the light seemed to get brighter, or maybe it was just that they couldn't help but notice it anymore. They all started commenting on this light. They're all looking at it, and somebody in the truck suggested that, "Oh, it's probably just the moon. It's a full moon tonight." But then one of the other guys on the other side of the truck happened to look out his window away from where the light was. And he goes, "No, the moon's over here. It's on this side of the road." So they knew it wasn't the moon. Then someone else suggested, maybe it's a forest fire. Maybe we should go check it out. But then Mike Rogers, who was driving, the crew boss, he's like, "No, if it was a fire, there'd be smoke. There's no smoke or anything." And then there was Travis. Remember, this is the guy who jumps out of cars to chase down bears. He was a total adrenaline junkie. And he's like, "Hey, let's just drive over there and see what it is. I don't know, it could be anything. Let's go check it out." The other guys in the truck were a little on edge about the idea, but ultimately they figured, what's the harm? They knew there was another little road that led over to that section of the forest. They'd just drive over, get a quick look at whatever this thing was, and then they'd leave. So they turn and they drive down this other little access road. They come around a bend and they pull into a clearing where the lights were coming from. And they are absolutely astounded by what they see. Every single one of them was later polygraphed separately about what they saw when they reached this clearing. And each one of them described the exact same thing with just slightly different details based on their own perspective. And all of the polygraph tests showed that they were all telling the truth. What they saw was this disc-shaped craft. It had what looked like panels of lights on its underside, and it was just hovering there in the clearing, maybe 50 or 100 feet off the ground. It wasn't spinning or moving at all. It was just floating in midair, as if it was suspended by nothing. And the men, in their interviews later on, they would all say that what struck them was not just the fact that there was this craft there, but how bizarre it was to see this thing just defying gravity. It wasn't moving at all, but it was just hanging there in the air right in front of them. One of the men, a guy who actually built houses and was a very handy guy, he even started commenting at length about the structural framework of this craft. He could see that there was some really impressive engineering on the underside of it. He said it was just a beautiful, beautiful machine. And they're all just sitting there in the truck staring at it. And Travis, he is so excited when they get to this clearing. He has no idea what he's looking at, but just like with the bear, where he jumped out and chased it, as soon as the truck was almost at a complete stop in this clearing, right next to this ship, he's jumping out of the car. Nobody else gets out, just Travis. And he starts walking just a little ways away from the truck, straight towards this craft. The craft doesn't move. It's just hovering there. From where they had parked, it was maybe 50 or 100 feet away from them, and then another 50 or 100 feet up in the air. And the crew, they don't say anything at first. They're just completely dumbfounded by what they're looking at. Travis is also dumbfounded, but he's walking towards it. He would say later in an interview that he was frightened, but he was mostly just curious. He knew he was looking at something that no one had ever seen before, some sort of craft that he couldn't identify, but it was absolutely fascinating to him. And so he kept walking closer and closer and closer to it. And as the crew in the truck kind of came out of their initial shock of seeing this unidentified flying object, they start yelling for Travis to come back. They all had this bad feeling, this sense that something was about to happen. And they thought, you shouldn't go near that thing. Come back. Not to mention, it's just hovering there in the air. What if it just falls and lands on you? They're yelling, Travis, get back over here. And it was like once one person started yelling for Travis to come back, they all did. And Travis remembered hearing them screaming for him to get back to the truck, but he wasn't really paying any attention. He just kept walking. And finally, he stops. He's just standing there, looking up at it. And Travis would say he was just struck by the beauty of the underside of this craft with all these different panels of lights built into it. It was this incredible piece of machinery. He's just looking at it, and then all of a sudden, it starts to spin just a little bit. And it starts to emit this noise, this loud mechanical sound that all of them reported hearing. And now, the yells from the crew are getting louder and louder. And Travis would say that he knew he needed to turn around and go back, but he just wanted to look for a few more seconds. He was just about to turn and head back to the truck when all of a sudden a beam of light comes out of the craft and strikes Travis, just like a lightning strike. And all of the crew saw this happen. He gets blown back about 20 feet. He was literally lifted off the ground and thrown 20 feet through the air. And they watched it all happen. Again, in all of their polygraph tests, they all said the exact same thing, and they all passed. He was hit by a ray of light from this UFO, and it knocked him back 20 feet. Mike Rogers, in a complete panic, along with everybody else in the crew, they just decided to leave. And as Mike is driving away like a maniac, leaving Travis behind, they're all trying to convince themselves that he's already dead. They're saying, we just watched him get shot by something. We don't know what that is. They're completely freaked out. They don't even know what they just saw. They're crying. They're hysterical. These are grown men, just absolutely terrified. And they're driving for a little ways until finally Mike just slams on the brakes and he stops the truck. And Mike is like, we have to go back for him. He said, you guys can stay here and wait for me if you want, but this truck is going back to get Travis. And so the idea of waiting out there in the open after seeing what they just saw was even worse than the idea of going back. They wanted to stay together. So, a little bit begrudgingly, but knowing that they had to do it, they all got back in the truck. Mike turned it around and they started driving back up to the site where the UFO was. As they make it back up to the clearing, they notice that there are no lights up there anymore. The craft is gone. And there's no Travis. They get out of the truck, and now Mike is just uncontrollably crying because he feels like they just abandoned his friend, and now where did he go? Everybody else is in total shock. They can't believe it. They started screaming for Travis. They're running around in the woods, yelling his name, looking for any sign of him. They really don't know what happened, but they know Travis is not there. And after a little bit of time of looking, they're like, we have to tell the police. And they knew it was going to be bad for them. They knew that when they told the police the story, a UFO came and zapped Travis and now he's gone. They knew that wasn't going to sit well with the police. But they also knew that they had to do it because they wanted to find Travis and they were very, very concerned about their friend. Mike and a few of the other crew members were just unable to even think straight. They were crying. They were so upset. And so finally, they drive until they get to a payphone. The first payphone they saw, this was 1975. And a man named Ken Peterson, who was this very kind of simple, matter-of-fact guy, recently married, just a very simple, level-headed person, he decides that he's going to be the one to call the police because he was the only one who was composed enough to do it. He calls the sheriff's department and he says, you've got to come out here. We can't find our friend, Travis Walton. We'll have to describe it to you when you get here because trying to do it over the phone is not going to do it justice. But he's gone, and we don't know where he went. Shortly after that, Sheriff Marlon Gillespie and his partner Ken Coplin, they show up at this rest stop where the payphone was. They get to the scene, they see Ken Peterson, who made the call to them, and they're like, all right, tell us what's going on. The rest of the crew has now gotten out of the truck. They definitely look distraught. And Ken begins to try to describe what happened, but he hasn't said the word UFO. He hasn't said aliens. He just said, we were up at the logging site, we had a contract up there, and then, it's just hard to describe. And Mike Rogers jumps in. He's like, we saw a UFO, an array of light hit Travis, and then he disappeared. And the sheriffs are just looking at them like, really? And so they stopped him right there and said, all right, I need to search your truck to make sure you guys aren't under the influence of something. And the crew's like, we haven't done anything. We've been working all day. They search the truck, find nothing. They check each of the men to see if they're sober, and all of their field tests show that they were all completely sober. And Sheriff Gillespie, who was the main sheriff in charge, even though he was a total skeptic and so was Sheriff Copeland, he would later say that during that first engagement with the 6 crew members, they were obviously shaken up by something. Something had happened to them. They didn't know what it was, but these men were genuinely shaken up. What Sheriff Gillespie actually believed was that they were creating a hoax to cover up a real crime. He believed that they had harmed Travis Walton in some way, and they were using this UFO story to cover it up. But he was also thinking to himself, this is a really bad hoax. It's not very well planned. They don't really have their stories lined up particularly well. They're not doing a very good job of explaining it. The only thing they're doing well is acting scared. A couple of hours later, the sun is starting to come up. This had all happened super late at night. And Sheriff Gillespie and Sheriff Copeland have organized this huge search effort up in the forest where Travis had gone missing. The crew members, they're all still there as well. A bunch of volunteers showed up. They are scouring the entire area. I mean, they've got dogs out, they've got these huge teams of people looking everywhere, and they can't come up with anything. I mean, they are looking everywhere, and there is no sign. There's nothing. There is nothing from Travis. And so, while all this is going on, Sheriff Copeland and Sheriff Gillespie have started coming over to Mike Rogers and the rest of the crew and basically saying things like, hey, if you just tell us where Travis Walton's body is, we'll go easy on you guys. We know you did it. And the crew can feel that the pressure is really mounting. They know that if they don't find Travis, even though they didn't do anything, according to their story, they're going to face serious repercussions. Because that's just the way the world works. You don't get to say aliens did this and not have any blame placed on you because there's no proof. They just have their own eyewitness testimony, and that's it. And so the crew has started to become very worried about what's going to happen. They're worried about Travis, of course, but they're also starting to see that they're probably going to be prosecuted for this unless they find Travis. And so they're all very stressed out. And they notice during the search, on this first day of searching, that there are these 3 guys wearing red jackets. And these guys had these tools that were scanning the ground, almost like a metal detector. And Mike Rogers, he was hoping that during this investigation, they would have people come out who were like paranormal investigators. I guess maybe he was a little naive to think that the police would actually do that, but he thought, given the fact that we've all said this was a UFO that zapped Travis, who then disappeared, that they would have at least one person representing the kind of paranormal side of the investigation coming out. And so he sees these guys in red with their special tools that look like metal detectors, and his gut tells him they're paranormal investigators. So Mike goes over to them and he's like, hey, what are these tools you guys are using? What is this? And they look at him and they're like, oh, well, this test for radiation, we're scanning for radiation in the area. And he asked them, what group are you guys with? Are you with the sheriff's department? And they just didn't really answer him. They just said, oh, we're just checking for radiation in the area. That's just what we do. And Mike sees an opportunity here. Because when that ship emitted that ray of light that ultimately blew Travis Walton 20 feet and then made him disappear, they were within range of that big ball of lightning. And they were very much in the kind of cone where if there had been radiation coming off of that ship, he believed that perhaps they would have been hit with it. And so he asked the guys with the red jackets and their little radiation tools to scan the crew's jackets and their bodies to see if they were radioactive. And so the crew comes over and they scan them and there's nothing. No trace elements of radioactivity. They're like, no, there's nothing here. And then Mike realizes that from the time they called the sheriff until the search started, all of the crew had gone home and changed clothes before they came back out to do the search. And so he thought, well then, any of the radioactive materials would have been on our clothes, which aren't here. But we have our hard hats in the back of the truck that were out here the whole time. They were potentially exposed to whatever was out there from the ship. Can you test those? And so he brought over one of their helmets. And the guy in red scans the helmet, and the ticker goes all the way over, fully radioactive. And the guy in red, he looked up at Mike and then looked down at the helmet he was scanning. And he's looking at him, kind of trying to size him up. And then he turns and he kind of gestures at the other two men in red and tells them to stop what they're doing. And they come over and they're scanning the helmets as well. And then, without any indication of what the results were or what this meant, because Mike is kind of waiting for them to tell him what's going to happen, the guys in red just turn around and say, okay. And they just start walking away. And Mike's like, well, wait, what does this mean? And they don't turn around. They just walk away from the search site. And so the other crew members are watching this happen too. And Mike and the crew are like trying to get them to come back, but they're not turning around. They're just leaving. And then they're gone. And so Mike goes over to the sheriffs. And they know the sheriffs think they did something to Travis. These are not their friends. But they figured they needed to ask them who those guys in red were. So they go over to Sheriff Gillespie and they're like, hey, who were those guys in the red jackets with the radiation detectors? And Sheriff Gillespie is like, who? There's no one here looking for radiation. Everyone who is here because I ordered them to be here. Who are they? Where are they? And he's like, they just walked over there. They went around the corner there, and Sheriff Gillespie was like, well, I didn't order them to be here. And it would turn out that they couldn't locate these three people. No one knew who they were. Mike went around and asked anybody who seemed like an authority figure if they knew who these people were. They asked people that interacted with them, and no one knew. After the search, which goes on for a couple of days, turns up absolutely nothing. There's no sign of Travis. The town of Snowflake, Arizona really turned on the 6 crew members. Everybody believed that they had done something to Travis. They believed that this UFO thing was a hoax and that they had harmed Travis and were using this as a cover-up. And the sheriff's department, they really perpetuated that idea. They were pretty open about the fact that they did not believe this was a UFO situation. This was not an alien abduction. This was a missing person case, and frankly, they believed the UFO thing was a complete hoax. National and international media had picked this story up, and it became this massively viral story all over the world. News media outlets were converging on Snowflake, Arizona, and they were inundating the sheriff's department with requests for more information about the supposed alien abduction. And it was really frustrating the 2 sheriffs who were leading the investigation, Sheriff Gillespie and Sheriff Copeland. They were already skeptical and really upset about feeling like they were being taken advantage of by these crew members with this hoax as they believed it was. And so Sheriff Gillespie and Copeland decided, you know what? We're going to just cut through all the BS here. We're going to make these boys take a lie detector test. So they go out and they get one of the country's best polygraph examiners to come in and administer a lie detector test on each of the 6 crew members. And so one by one, over the course of the day, each crew member was tested for 2 hours. They were asked the same questions, all centering on the criminal side of things, the foul play angle for Travis Walton. They all go through it. And it turned out that 5 of the 6 had all shown that they were telling the truth. And the 6th person, his test was just inconclusive. It didn't mean that he was lying, it just meant that the test wasn't done very well. And this polygraph examiner, he had anywhere from a 92 to a 98% accuracy rate. He was one of the best in the entire country. And he even would say, it would be so difficult to fake that, to have 5 people, let's say this is all a big hoax, and they harmed Travis Walton, it would be almost impossible to have 5 people be able to pass my examination and have nobody slip up. They were telling the truth. And so the examiner tells the sheriff this. And Sheriff Gillespie is just dumbfounded. because he truly believed that they were going to find out they were all lying and that this could just become a pure criminal investigation and it would be, let's go find Travis Walton's body. But now, the examiner is telling him they're telling the truth. And so Sheriff Gillespie and his partner are like, now what do we do? And then, 5 days after Travis's disappearance, Travis shows back up. During numerous interviews, Travis would say that he remembers waking up on a road. He didn't recognize where he was, but it was nighttime, it was raining, and he sensed a very bright light above him. And so as he's lying there, he turns his head to look up into the sky, and he sees what looks like the underside of that ship. Because he remembered how struck he was by the beauty of the engineering underneath that disc UFO they saw in the forest. It looked the same. His vision was not great, but he's looking up, and he's pretty confident that's what he's looking at. And then it just flies up into the sky, and it's gone. And he's left in total darkness on a road in some place he doesn't know. He remembers standing up and feeling very weak and depleted and dehydrated, and he just knew that he had to get to civilization. He had to just go in a direction and find someone who could help him because he was so weak. He knew he would die out there if he didn't find someone who could help. And so he musters up the strength to stand up, and he starts kind of staggering down the road. And eventually, through just pure adrenaline, he just starts running. And luckily, he sees up ahead that there's a rest stop. And at rest stops, there are payphones. He makes his way down, and he goes to the payphone. And he still has change in his pocket. He puts it in the payphone, and he ends up calling his brother. And his brother, he can't believe he's talking to Travis, because at this point, everyone assumed Travis was probably dead. He didn't believe it was actually Travis. But Travis just said to him over and over again, "It's me. They brought me back." And he tells him where he is because now he recognizes that this rest stop is actually in Snowflake, Arizona. When his brother picks him up, Travis would say that he believed that this was just minutes after the initial abduction. He didn't even know he had been abducted. It's like he's just coming to, and he's like, man, what happened? I was just over at that clearing where I saw this ship, and now I'm over here. What am I doing here? And so Travis's brother is looking at him like, where have you been? We've been so worried about you for the past several days. And Travis was kind of almost catatonic. He's in shock. He doesn't know what's going on. He looks at his brother and he's like, what do you mean days? And his brother's like, you've been missing for 5 days. And so Travis would say that when he heard this news, this revelation that he had been missing for 5 days, it absolutely put him into shock. He was in a catatonic state where he couldn't make sense of it. And so he just sat there quietly, and his brother is looking at him, not really sure what to even ask. He asked him a couple of times what happened, and Travis just didn't answer because he didn't know. He couldn't explain it. And so Travis's brother decides, instead of just immediately calling the police, I want to bring you to a hospital because clearly that needs to happen. And frankly, with the media circus that's going on, as soon as they find out you're back, it's just going to be mayhem. I want to make sure you're taken care of first. So he drives to Phoenix, Arizona, and he brings him to a hospital. And he asks the doctors to be discreet. And he has a doctor do an examination. The doctor knew who Travis Walton was because he had been following the news. And he's doing an examination of Travis, and, he was malnourished, and he was tired, and he looked very sick. But there were no physical wounds, with the exception of one puncture site in his arm, in the crook of his arm. Travis was not a drug user, so it wasn't like that was a mark from using drugs. It was a puncture site. And they assumed someone had recently put a needle in his arm. And also, the doctor drug tested him and tested his blood, and there were no drugs in his system. It wasn't like he'd been using any sort of substance. So he kind of had a clear bill of health, minus the injection site and looking pretty ragged. And so after the examination, Travis's brother brings Travis back to his home in Phoenix. As soon as they get back, his home phone is getting constant phone calls. Word had made its way to the sheriff's department back in Snowflake, and they're nonstop calling Travis's brother like, hey, we hear he's back. We have to talk to him. We have to talk to him. Sheriff Gillespie, he drives all the way to Phoenix. He goes in and he sits down to talk to Travis. And Sheriff Gillespie would say that Travis looked like he was in shock. He looked like he had been through something traumatic. It did not seem like he was acting. And he starts asking Travis what happened. And Travis, he does mention the UFO. He mentioned seeing this thing in a clearing, that he gets struck by some light. He doesn't know what it was. And then, he's on the road 5 days later, and he can't really make sense of what happened. He just didn't really know what happened over those 5 days. And finally, Sheriff Gillespie just kind of had to give up. He's like, well, we have no way to arrest him. We have no proof of anything. And so he decided, we're going to be in touch, and he drives back. And then the media starts showing up. Huge news trucks start showing up outside. Everybody had found out where he was because this was such a huge story, and everybody wanted answers. Finally, the National Enquirer, they reached out and they said, hey, if you give us an exclusive story, if Travis speaks to us about what happened to him, we will get you out of here. We'll bring you to a private location, and we'll even pay to have Travis undergo a whole other battery of tests that are not typically done to see if they could figure out what had happened to him. And so they agreed to go with the National Enquirer. So by the time he's actually sitting there talking to the people from the National Enquirer, he's had a little bit of time to maybe let his memory kind of kick back in about what had happened. And he's having these flashes of memory of what happened over those 5 days. Because initially, all he could remember was seeing the craft and then being on the road 5 days later. And so when he's sitting down with the National Enquirer people, he begins to recall what actually happened over those 5 days. And so this is what he said happened. He said that he remembers getting out of the truck and walking towards this craft, and he remembers his crew members yelling at him to come back. He knew they were yelling at him to come back. He just wanted to look at the craft a little bit longer. And then, right as he was about to turn around and head back, the craft started moving. This loud, kind of mechanical, eerie sound is being made, and before he had a chance to run back, he gets hit with this lightning bolt of some kind. Then, he remembers being in the presence of some doctors. He saw white lab coats, masks, and facial coverings. And he's kind of in and out of consciousness. And he's seeing this orange light around him, but he definitely sees what looks like medical professionals. And he's thinking to himself, whatever happened with that ship, it must have hurt me. And my crew must have scooped me up and brought me to the hospital. And so in his kind of in and out state, he's aware that he's around medical professionals, or at least what he believes are medical professionals. And at some point, his vision clears. It goes from foggy and in and out to being pretty much lucid. And he looks down at his chest, and there's a rectangular box sitting on his chest that he didn't recognize. It didn't really look like modern medical equipment. It just looked like this, almost like a rock, sitting on his chest. And he looks at that, and then he looks up at one of the people who's wearing a mask, who's working on him, one of the medical professionals, and this person is working on this box. And then the person looks at Travis Walton and then leans in to look even closer at Travis Walton. And Travis is horrified. It was this grayish, thin, narrow-headed figure that was very short, maybe like 4 feet high, who was looking in at him. And its eyes were like slits. And it's just looking at Travis. And Travis, who's unbelievably scared at this point, he pushes everything off of him and rips out all the cords that are attached to him. He kind of topples off of this table that he was on. And he realizes he's in a fairly small room, and there are 3 of these humanoid creatures in the room with him. And he picks up the biggest instrument he can see next to the table that he was just lying on. He didn't know what it was. And he starts wildly waving it at them and screaming at them, "Get away from me!" And he's trying to make sense of what he's looking at. And the 3 figures in the lab coats, they start walking closer and closer to him. And they're just kind of looking up at him, trying to study him a little bit. They get all the way up to him, and he's waving this thing, and he's almost about to hit one of them when they just kind of abruptly turn around and leave the room, leaving him all alone in this kind of examination room. And as soon as they leave, he watches them go down a little hallway outside the door, and they turn left. And so he's practically paralyzed with fear, but he knows if he can't get out of this room, he's done for. And so finally, he kind of gets himself together and he walks past the examination table. He goes down the hallway outside of the door, and instead of going left where they went, he kind of sneaks off to the right and starts walking. And he comes to another room. And it's a room that has a single chair in it. It's this tiny little room with a chair, and the chair is turned away from him. He begins to peer around the chair, and he sees that no one is sitting there. So he goes around in front of the chair, and he's like touching the wall, looking for a doorknob or any sort of mechanism that can get him out of this room. And he said the room, it was like this perfectly flat, everything was flat and smooth. There were no door handles. He couldn't find a way out. And he ultimately sees on the chair that it looks like there are some buttons on the chair itself. He pushes all these buttons on the chair and nothing happens. And then in the doorway where he came in, suddenly a man, appears in the doorway who's wearing what looks like a spacesuit, like an astronaut suit. And Travis is so immediately relieved. Even though the weirdness of him being in an astronaut suit is pretty high, he's like, it's a human. And he doesn't know what to think about the fact that he's now excited to see a human, right? Like, it's terrifying that you were just around these non-humans, but he's in panic mode now. He sees another human being, and he runs over to him, and he says, please, you've got to help me. I don't know where I am. Where are we? What is this? What's going on? And he notices that the eyes of this person inside of the spacesuit, it's a man, or at least it looks like a man, but his eyes are distant. He's not making eye contact with Travis. It's like he's in a trance. And he said his eyes just seemed off, like they just weren't focused on him. It would be like if you're talking to someone, but they were permanently looking away from you. There was just something off about him, and he never spoke. And so he's trying to ask this guy, where are we? And the guy takes him by the arm, and he just starts leading him back into the hall where he came from, and they continue down the hall, not back towards the room where he was originally, but down the hall in the other direction, and they get to another door, and he opens it up. And Travis the whole time is like pleading with this guy to help him, and he thinks that this guy is helping him. He thinks that this is his savior. And he feels relieved that a human being, albeit a strange human being, is helping him. And eventually, he stops asking him any questions because the guy in the spacesuit is just not reacting to him at all. They open this door, and they go down into this huge hangar where there are all these spacecraft that look just like the one that he saw in the clearing. And they start walking down between all these spacecraft that are just hovering, much like they were hovering in the forest, seemingly able to just defy gravity. And the whole time, this guy in the spacesuit is saying nothing. And Travis is like, what is this? What are these craft? Is this military? The guy says nothing. They walk to the far side of the hangar, and they open up another door. And they go into another bright white room. And there are 3 more human-like people with the strange eye thing going on in spacesuits that are standing there next to another medical table. And they're looking not at Travis, but their bodies are aimed in the direction of the door that they came in through. Travis goes in, and he sees these 3, and he thinks, these people are here to save me. Like, again, I feel relieved to see humans, albeit strange humans, but nonetheless, humans. And the guy who had brought him in there continues to lead him over to the 3 other people. And they pick him up, and they put him on the table. He starts kind of resisting because he doesn't know what they're doing. They're not speaking. He said, what are you doing? And they forced him onto this table, and he's feeling pretty weak at this point. And they take a gas mask, and they put it over his face. And then he blacks out. And his next memory after that is when he woke up on the road and had the light above him that flew away, and he had to go to the payphone to call his brother. Travis did not immediately go and speak to the crew members that were there that night. It took quite a bit of time. You know, he was talking to the press, he was doing interviews, the police wanted to talk to him. There was a lot going on. But he eventually got together with the other 6 crew members. And they all met up at Mike Rogers, the crew boss's house. And they just said, "You've got to tell us what happened." And so he sits down and he tells the story. All of them believed him. They didn't want to believe him, but they believed him because they saw the first half of this story. They saw it for themselves, and once he was done telling it, they didn't really have that many questions. They just felt bad. They felt like if they had just stayed there and taken Travis, he wouldn't have been taken. But they didn't know that. And so all of them would leave Mike's house that day, and they would all go their separate ways. They did not stay in touch. They went their separate ways. It was like this hugely traumatic event that even to this day, you have 40 plus years later, when they talk about it, they're often brought to tears. Ken Peterson's interviews are particularly striking because when he talks about it, he's an older man now, and he says, "To this day, I'm scared to look out my window because I'm afraid I'm going to see a spaceship." And he starts crying when he talks about it. I mean, this had a profound impact on these 7 men. And some of them didn't do so well. This whole story, it ruined their credibility. Even though this is the most believable alien abduction story, the truth is, most people think it's a hoax. One of them, his own family, basically disowned him because they felt so embarrassed about this whole story. They didn't believe him. So, if this was a hoax, to what end? What did they get out of it? Nothing. It damaged their lives. Following this case, over the span of 40 years, there would be 16 lie detector tests taken. 5 by Travis Walton and 11 by the remaining crew. And they would all pass. The one member of that initial polygraph set, when 5 had passed and 1 was inconclusive, he was retested with the same exact test, and he did pass. It's just one of those things where we're left with this incredible story where modern technology says they're telling the truth, but we can't fit that truth into what we think of as normal life. And so we've just decided that there's going to be a group of people that believe, and there's going to be a group of people that don't. And you're left to pick which side you're on. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. One morning in 2017, 25-year-old Watanabe Takuya walked through the front doors of Keio University Hospital in Tokyo, Japan. He wasn't panicking and he wasn't asking for help right away, but something about him immediately felt off. His skin was drenched in sweat from a fever. A deep headache pulsed behind his eyes with every step he took. And as he approached the check-in desk, he kept one hand tightly pressed against his right ear. Fluid was leaking from it. For most people, symptoms like that would have been terrifying. But Takuya mainly felt annoyed, because this wasn't the first time something like this had happened to him. Takuya had a long and difficult history with a condition known as cholesteatoma. It's basically a non-cancerous skin cyst that grows deep inside the ear canal, and it can cause a lot of problems if it's not treated. When Takuya was just a teenager, he'd had to go through multiple surgeries to get these cysts removed. The doctors had worked hard to make sure they got every last bit of it so it wouldn't come back. And for nearly a decade, it seemed like they had succeeded. The surgeries had worked. The cysts were gone, and he had been able to live a normal life without constant ear problems. But then, about 2 weeks before this hospital visit, the old, familiar symptoms started to return. He noticed a constant drainage coming out of his right ear. It was a clear sign that the cyst was back. Initially, Takuya had tried to ignore it. He was busy with work and life, and the idea of going back to the hospital, of possibly facing another surgery, was something he just didn't want to deal with. He put it off, hoping it might just clear up on its own, even though deep down he knew that was unlikely. But now, with the fever and the pounding headache, he couldn't deny it any longer. He was pretty sure the recurring cyst had caused him to develop a nasty ear infection. That would explain why he felt so sick. And so, here he was, back at the hospital, hand pressed to his ear, feeling frustrated with himself for waiting so long. He walked up to the check-in desk and explained his symptoms and his medical history to the receptionist. She listened patiently, nodded, and typed all his information into the computer. Seeing the state he was in, she quickly had him admitted to the emergency room. About half an hour passed, Takuya was now lying in a bed in the emergency room. The bright, sterile lights of the room were so intense they felt like they were stabbing into his eyes, making his headache even worse. So he just kept his eyes closed. But even with his eyes shut, he could hear the quiet sounds of the ER, and he sensed a doctor standing right beside his bed. He listened as the doctor began to go over the results of the initial tests they had run. The doctor's voice was calm and professional. He confirmed what Takuya had already suspected. Based on his medical history and the fluid clearly leaking from his ear, they were almost certain that his cyst had returned and had led to a severe ear infection. The doctor then mentioned that it was very likely Takuya would need another surgery to get rid of the cyst once and for all. But then the doctor's tone shifted slightly. He said they didn't want to operate just yet. There was a bigger, more immediate problem they had to deal with first. The preliminary blood tests had shown something alarming. The doctor explained that Takuya's ear infection had become so bad that the infection had actually started to spread to the tissue surrounding his brain. This was an extremely dangerous development. It could lead to meningitis, permanent brain damage, and even death if it wasn't treated aggressively and immediately. When Takuya heard this, his annoyance and frustration were instantly replaced by a cold wave of shock and fear. This was far more serious than he had ever imagined. But more than anything, he just felt angry at himself. He knew with a sinking feeling that if he had just come to the hospital 2 weeks ago when the drainage first started, the infection likely never would have gotten this bad. He had tried to avoid the problem, and now it had spiraled into something life-threatening. It was too late for regrets now. Takuya forced his eyes open, squinting against the painful light, and looked at the doctor. He asked what they could do. The doctor laid out the plan. They were going to admit him to the hospital, not just keep him in the ER, and start him immediately on a very powerful intravenous dose of antibiotics to fight the infection that was threatening his brain. 2 weeks later, Takuya was still a patient in the hospital. He was lying flat on his back, being slowly rolled into the large, white, donut-shaped ring of a CT machine. The machine would scan the inside of his head, giving the doctors a detailed picture of what was going on. By this point, the powerful antibiotics had done their job. The dangerous infection around his brain had been cured, his fever was gone, and his headache had finally subsided. He was feeling much better. But despite this progress, one symptom remained. His ear was still leaking fluid. It wasn't constant anymore, but it was still happening on and off, a sign that the root problem was still there. And so, the doctors had ordered this CT scan. Their goal was to look inside Takuya's head, pinpoint the exact location and size of the suspected cyst, and map out exactly how they were going to approach the surgery to remove it. Takuya laid perfectly still for about 5 minutes as the CT machine whirred and clicked around him, taking hundreds of images of his skull and brain. When it was finished, a nurse helped him out of the machine and led him back to his hospital room to wait. A little while later, one of the hospital doctors came into his room holding a folder with some papers inside. The doctor told Takuya that based on the results of the CT scan, he had some good news. Takuya actually didn't need another surgery on his ear. For a moment, Takuya felt a huge wave of relief wash over him. He had been mentally preparing himself for another operation, and the news that it wasn't necessary was incredible. But that happy feeling only lasted for a second. He saw the doctor's expression shift. The professional calm was gone, replaced by a deeply troubled look. The doctor then explained the reason why he didn't need surgery for a cyst. It was because there was no cyst in his ear at all. The real problem, the actual cause of all his symptoms, was something much, much worse. The doctor pulled an image from the stack of papers and handed it to Takuya. It was a cross-section from his CT scan. When Takuya looked at it, he could not believe what he was seeing. It would turn out Takuya had an extremely rare condition called Gorham-Stout disease, which is more commonly known as vanishing bone disease. It is a mysterious and devastating illness where the body's own systems, for no known reason, begin to break down and absorb its own bone tissue. In Takuya's case, the bones of his skull were literally disappearing, dissolving away almost like an ice cube melting in the sun. And that fluid that had been leaking out of his ear for weeks, it wasn't from an infection. It was cerebrospinal fluid, the fluid that cushions the brain, which was now flowing out through the holes that were forming in his skull. Unfortunately, then and now, there is no known cure for Gorham-Stout disease. The best doctors can do is try to manage the symptoms and patch the damage as it occurs. And that's exactly what they did for Takuya. Surgeons went in and used a special kind of biomedical glue to literally plug up the holes that were forming in his skull. Amazingly, the procedure seemed to work. Takuya's doctors monitored him closely for any further bone loss and fluid leakage. As of his most recent publicly released checkup in 2018, he appeared to be doing quite well. One afternoon in late January of 2018, a father named Dan Levitas stood inside the bathroom that his 3 kids shared in their house in Madison, Wisconsin. With a sigh of frustration, Dan grabbed his kids' toothbrushes from the holder by the sink and threw them straight into the garbage can. Then he picked up a bottle of disinfectant spray and went to work, spraying the counters, the sink, the faucet, the mirror, basically every single surface he could see, and began wiping everything down with paper towels. Dan was doing this deep clean because his entire family, himself, his wife, and their 3 young children all had strep throat. Their family doctor had explained that the best way to get rid of it for good was a 2-pronged attack. Everybody had to take a full course of antibiotics, and they had to deep clean the house from top to bottom to get rid of any lingering bacteria that might have caused the infection. However, as Dan scrubbed down the bathroom counters, he felt a deep sense of frustration. This was not the first time his family had gone through this exact routine. This was not the second or third time either. Over the past 4 months, his entire family had come down with strep throat a staggering 6 times. And no matter how many antibiotics they took, or how many times they threw out their toothbrushes and deep cleaned the entire house, it felt like the sickness always found a way to come back. It was a miserable, unending cycle. This was especially baffling to Dan because he was actually a biologist. He understood bacteria and how infections spread better than most people. He had already gone through a mental checklist of every possible source for this recurring infection. He checked at his own workplace and his wife's, but nobody else was getting sick. He checked with his kids' school and their daycare, and again, no other children or staff members were repeatedly getting strep. So he knew the infection couldn't be coming from any of those places. This just didn't make any sense. If the source wasn't outside the home, it had to be inside. But each of the 6 times they got sick, Dan and his wife had been incredibly thorough. They had systematically disinfected the entire house, going far beyond just the bathrooms. They cleaned every doorknob, every light switch, every toy, every surface they could think of. If there was strep bacteria hiding somewhere in the house, it surely should have been wiped out by now. It was as if the bacteria was somehow surviving their cleaning blitz, hiding in some place they had never thought to look. He just couldn't figure out where it could be. But regardless, Dan still dutifully finished disinfecting the bathroom for the 6th time. When he was done, he went to the kitchen. On the counter was a small pile of prescription bottles, antibiotics for the whole family. Dan took his own dose and then prepared the doses for everyone else. He went to his daughter's room first. His 2 girls, who were 6 and 3 years old, were both lying in their beds, looking completely miserable and flushed with fever. He gave them their medicine before heading to his and his wife's bedroom. He found his wife sitting up in bed, and she was cuddling their very sick 1-year-old son. Dan handed his wife her antibiotics and then looked down at his son. The little boy looked so small and so vulnerable, and it just broke Dan's heart to think about how many times this poor kid had been sick in his short life and how powerless he, as a father, felt to protect him. Dan felt like they were doing everything right. They were following the doctor's orders to the letter, but they were now on their 7th round of illness, and clearly nothing was changing. The advice they were getting wasn't helping. It felt like they were trapped in an awful nightmare they couldn't wake up from. But then, as Dan stood there feeling utterly defeated, he thought of something. His own mother was a retired pediatrician. She had decades of experience, and maybe, just maybe, she might have a different perspective or some advice that their current doctor hadn't considered. So he sat down on the edge of the bed, took out his phone, and called his mom to explain the situation and ask for help. And it turned out Dan's mom did have a theory. It was a theory about where this relentless strep bacteria was coming from and how to finally get rid of it. But because Dan was a biologist and he understood how bacteria functioned on a scientific level, he knew that his mother's theory was, to put it mildly, out there. Most scientists and medical professionals would probably say that her idea was basically impossible. But at this point, after 6 bouts of strep throat, Dan and his family were desperate. They were ready to try anything, no matter how unconventional it seemed. So, Dan decided he would try to test his mother's theory. He began looking for an expert who could help him. But every expert Dan got in touch with, every lab and every doctor he called, turned him down as soon as they heard what his theory actually was. Nobody was prepared to even entertain the idea. It felt like he was so close to finding an answer, to finally curing his family of this horrible problem, but he was being blocked at every turn because the medical community wouldn't even consider it as a possibility. About a month later, in early March, Dan was inside a hospital room sitting next to his wife. They were both staring down at their 3-year-old daughter. She was lying in a hospital bed, looking tiny and frail, hooked up to an IV drip and wearing an oxygen mask. She had gotten strep throat for the 7th time. And this time, it was much worse. She had gotten so sick that she had also developed pneumonia. At this point, Dan and his wife weren't even sure if she was going to survive. For Dan, this was the absolute breaking point. He was on the verge of a complete breakdown. He was convinced that the only way to save his children was to find someone, anyone, who would be willing to test his mother's theory. But they had already been turned down by basically every expert in the entire state of Wisconsin. Dan had no idea who else to turn to. As they sat there in the tense silence of the hospital room, watching their little girl fight for her life, Dan's wife suddenly turned to him. She had an idea. What if, instead of asking established medical professionals for help, they tried asking medical students? Maybe a student, someone more open-minded and not so set in their ways, would be more willing to test out a theory, even if it did seem kind of crazy. Dan agreed. It was a long shot, a final Hail Mary, but it was definitely worth a try. They reached out to the University of Wisconsin, and this time their desperate plea actually worked. On the 4th of April 2018, about 6 months after the first strep outbreak in their house, Dan and his wife took one very specific thing from their home and brought it to the University of Wisconsin. The student they had contacted agreed to analyze it. And after the analysis was complete, the results determined that Dan and his family's crazy theory was correct. It would turn out that Dan, his wife, and their 3 kids were not the only ones in their home suffering from strep throat. There was actually a 6th victim, their pet cat. Now, most veterinarians at the time didn't believe that cats could even catch the specific strain of strep that affects humans, let alone transmit it back to them. That's why all the professionals had refused to even test the family's cat. It went against everything they had been taught. It was not until Dan contacted the University of Wisconsin's veterinary school that a student finally agreed to run the test. And lo and behold, the test came back positive for the exact same strain of strep bacteria that the family kept catching. Their beloved cat was the carrier, constantly reinfecting them after every round of antibiotics. Dan's 3-year-old daughter would go on to make a full recovery from her pneumonia. And after one final round of antibiotics, this time including a dose for the cat, and one last deep clean of the house, the family's nightmare with strep throat finally went away for good. On the 30th of September 1964, a 44-year-old woman named Charlotte Lawrence stood with her husband just outside the door to her parents' apartment in a little city in southwestern Germany. Charlotte took a deep, shaky breath, the key trembling slightly in her hand. Then she unlocked the door and stepped slowly into her parents' home. Charlotte was here because of a sudden and terrible tragedy. Both of her parents had passed away just a few days ago. They had only been 70 and 76 years old, and by all accounts, they had both been in good health for their age. The story she had been told was as shocking as it was tragic. Her father had apparently suffered a massive heart attack right in their kitchen. And then, when her mother found him, the shock of it all was so great that she also had a heart attack and collapsed beside him. Charlotte's mother had managed to make a call to a doctor just before she passed, but by the time the doctor arrived, it was too late. Both of them were gone. Now, Charlotte and her husband didn't live in Germany. They had flown in that morning all the way from their home in Wisconsin. And up until this point, Charlotte had been trying to hold her emotions together, to be strong through the travel and the initial arrangements. But now, standing inside her parents' living room, surrounded by all of their familiar belongings, the pictures on the wall, the furniture they had owned for years, it was like a dam inside of her just broke. All of the grief and shock she had been holding back just poured out of her, and she broke down completely, sobbing uncontrollably. Her husband, not really knowing what else to do, gently guided her over to the couch. He turned on the television to a quiet program, hoping it might be a small distraction, and told her to just sit down and rest for a bit before they had to think about dinner. They actually had plans that evening. The next-door neighbor, an elderly woman named Caroline, who had been friends with her parents for years, had offered to come over and cook dinner for them. Charlotte's uncle, Dear, who lived nearby, also planned to come over after dinner to be with them. About 30 minutes later, while Charlotte was still sitting on the couch trying to compose herself while watching TV, Caroline, the neighbor, showed up at the door. She came in with 2 big bags full of groceries and, without any fuss, went right into the kitchen and began to cook. Pretty soon, the entire apartment, which had felt so empty and sad, was filled with the smell of comfort food cooking on the stove. It made Charlotte feel, admittedly, a little bit better. Eventually, Caroline called out from the kitchen that dinner was almost ready. So Charlotte got up from the couch, went into the kitchen, and sat down at the small dining table next to her husband. After Caroline served the food, the 3 of them began to eat together while they waited for her Uncle Dear to arrive. Not long after, Uncle Dear did arrive. He walked up to the front door of the apartment and knocked. He waited for a full minute, but nobody came to the door. Thinking maybe they hadn't heard him, he knocked again, louder this time. But still there was no answer. This was strange. Through the door, Dear could hear the sound of the television playing in the living room, but he couldn't hear any voices, no conversation, no sound of anyone moving around inside. After a couple more minutes of waiting and knocking, he decided he would just let himself in. The door was unlocked. As Dear walked through the living room, he began calling out for Charlotte, for her husband, and for Caroline. But still, nobody called back. The apartment was eerily quiet except for the noise from the TV. An uneasy feeling started to creep over him. This was very weird. They were expecting him, so where was everybody? He walked out of the living room and headed towards the kitchen, where a light was on. And there, he saw them. Charlotte, her husband, and Caroline were all sitting at the kitchen table. But something was terribly wrong. All 3 of them were just sitting there, motionless. Their plates of food were half eaten in front of them. But nobody was moving. Nobody was talking. It was like they were frozen in time, all just staring straight ahead with vacant expressions. Dear, confused and concerned, walked closer. He bent down and spoke to his niece. "Charlotte? What's going on? What are you guys doing?" But when he got a good close look at Charlotte's face, and then at Caroline's face, and her husband's face, his stomach just dropped. A wave of pure horror washed over him, and he stumbled backwards away from the table. What Dear saw in that kitchen was so terrifying, so eerie, and so awful, it would actually make international news. And that apartment would forever be known by a chilling nickname, the Death House. It turned out Charlotte's parents had not died from spontaneous heart attacks on the same day. That's not what happened at all. The tragic truth was that toxic, odorless sewer gas had been leaking into the apartment through a broken pipe under the kitchen sink. That silent, invisible gas had poisoned both of Charlotte's parents, causing their hearts to stop at almost the same time. Because no one suspected poisoning, nobody thought to check for a gas leak. So, when Charlotte and her husband arrived from Wisconsin, they came to stay in her parents' apartment without any idea that the air inside was still filled with that same deadly gas. And so, as Charlotte, her husband, and their kind neighbor Caroline sat down for dinner in the kitchen, right near the source of the leak, the gas slowly poisoned them as well. When Deer finally came over, he found them all sitting around the kitchen table, frozen in their last moments, because they were already gone. Fortunately, Deer's instinct after seeing the horrific scene was to immediately get out of the apartment and go call the authorities. It was that single, quick decision that ultimately saved his life. Let me know in the comments which of these 3 stories disturbed you the finest. Was it the man whose skull was slowly disappearing without him even realizing it? The family that kept getting mysteriously sick because the source of the infection was sleeping in their own home? Or the apartment where people unknowingly sat down for dinner inside a room that was silently killing them? And remember, some of the most terrifying things in the world don't look dangerous at all until it's already too late. If you want another story that will stick in your head long after the video ends, there's a full playlist waiting for you right now. See ya!